The morning began in a way that was no different from any other morning within the castle walls, and yet it carried the particular stillness that had settled over the land during the truce. The falconer, whose name was Aldrich, lay on a narrow cot in a small room attached to the far end of the mews, a room built directly into the outer curtain wall so that the stone behind his head was always cool and carried the faint mineral scent of old mortar and the deeper cold of the earth beyond. He opened his eyes not because any sound had disturbed him, but because the habit of years had set a clock within his body, a quiet inner signal that told him the hour was approaching the time of first light. Even though the window slit above his head showed only the deepest shade of grey, he lay still for a moment, breathing the air that smelled of clean straw from the floor, of leather from the hoods and jesses hanging on the wall, and of the faint, sweet, almost nutty scent of the dried herbs he kept in a cloth bag near the door, to keep the air fresh and to discourage vermin. The ceiling above him was a vault of narrow stones, set in the old manner, darkened by centuries of candle smoke to a rich charcoal hue that seemed to absorb the faint light rather than reflect it. And as he looked at these stones, he could trace the lines of mortar with his eyes in the same way he had done every morning for more years than he could easily count. There was a comfort in this sameness, in the knowledge that the stones had been there long before him and would remain long after, and that his presence in this small room was simply one more layer of the quiet history of the place. He swung his legs over the side of the cot and placed his bare feet on the wooden boards, feeling the familiar coolness of the planed oak and the slight give of the timber as it accepted his weight. The boards had been laid down by a carpenter whose name had been forgotten 2 generations ago, and they were worn smooth in the center where countless footsteps had passed, leaving a shallow depression like a gentle riverbed that guided the foot toward the door. Aldrich stood, and the routine of his body took over without any need for conscious thought. He reached for the woolen tunic that hung from a wooden peg, pulled it over his head, and felt the coarse weave settle against his shoulders, still carrying a trace of yesterday's warmth. He stepped into his leather boots, which were soft and supple from years of use and shaped perfectly to the contours of his feet, and laced them with a slow, steady rhythm, pulling each lace through the eyelets with the same amount of pressure he always used. A leather belt followed, simple and unadorned, except for a small iron buckle, and then he reached for the hooded cloak that hung by the door, a garment of heavy brown wool that had been patched at the elbows with slightly lighter cloth. The stitches small and even, the work of a patient hand on a long winter evening. He did not hurry because there was no need to hurry. The peregrine would still be asleep when he entered the main room of the mews, and the meat for the morning feeding was already prepared and waiting in the cool stone alcove where he stored it. The door of his room opened outward with a soft sigh of the iron hinges, a sound he had learned to recognize as distinct from all the other sounds in the mews, the particular pitch and duration of it as familiar as a voice. He stepped into the short passage that connected his quarters to the main mews chamber, a corridor so narrow that his shoulders nearly brushed both walls, and he walked its length in 7 measured strides, his boots making a soft scuffing sound on the flagstones. At the end of the passage, he paused with his hand on the latch of the inner door, and he listened. From the other side he could hear the softest of sounds, a slight rustle of feathers, the tiny click of a talon, adjusting its grip on the wooden perch block, and then stillness again, deep and complete. This was the sound of the peregrine beginning to stir, not yet fully awake, but moving in that half-conscious state that precedes true waking, the bird shifting its weight and resettling its wings in the way that all birds do when the light begins to change beyond their closed eyelids. Aldrich knew that if he waited too long, the peregrine would become fully alert and would begin to bait, flapping from the perch in that sudden explosion of motion that could damage new feathers during the molt, so he pressed the latch gently and opened the door. The main mews chamber was a long, high room built of the same grey stone as the rest of the castle, with a vaulted ceiling that arched overhead like the ribs of an upturned ship. The walls were pierced at regular intervals, with tall, narrow windows, each one fitted with a wooden shutter that could be opened or closed depending on the weather and the needs of the birds, and at this early hour the shutters were still closed, sealed tightly against the night air, so that the only light in the room came from the faintest thread of grey that crept along the edges of the wood. The air in here was different from the air in Aldrich's small chamber. It carried the distinct, not unpleasant scent of bird, a dry and slightly dusty odor that came from feathers, and the fine powder that new feathers produced as they grew, mixed with the clean smell of the straw that covered the stone floor in a thick layer. Along the far wall stood the perches, a series of wooden blocks set on stone plinths, their surfaces worn smooth by the grip of talons over many seasons, and on the nearest of these perches sat the peregrine. The bird was a silhouette in the darkness, a shape of deeper shadow against the shadow of the wall, and Aldrich could see the outline of its head tucked under one wing in the classic posture of avian sleep. The body a compact form of folded wings and still feathers that looked, in this light, almost like a carved stone figure on a tomb. He moved into the room with the quiet practice of long experience, his feet finding the places on the flagstones that did not rock or shift, his body moving around the scattered piles of straw and the low wooden table that stood in the center of the space. On this table sat a single candle in a simple iron holder, a stub of beeswax already burned halfway down from the previous night, and beside it lay a flint and a small steel striker. Aldrich picked up these objects and knelt on one knee, positioning the striker over the candlewick and bringing the flint down in a single sharp motion that produced a shower of sparks, one of which caught on the wick and bloomed into a small steady flame. The light pushed back the darkness in a circle about 10 feet wide, revealing the details of the room in soft, gradual increments. The grain of the wooden table, the curve of a leather glove hung on a hook, the gleam of a brass bell on a nearby shelf, and most of all the peregrine itself. The bird sat on its perch perhaps 15 feet from where Aldrich knelt, and as the candlelight touched its feathers, it stirred, lifting its head from beneath its wing with a slow, deliberate motion, and turning its dark eyes toward the flame. Those eyes were large and round and entirely black in the low light, ringed with a thin line of yellow that seemed almost to glow, and they regarded Aldrich with an expression that was neither curious nor indifferent, but something in between, the calm and patient gaze of a creature that had long ago accepted the presence of humans as a simple fact of its existence. The peregrine was in full molt, and there was no mistaking the signs. Its plumage, which in full health would have been sleek and tight and uniform, was now a patchwork of old feathers and new, some of them fully formed and others just emerging as pin feathers encased in waxy sheaths of pale keratin. Along the leading edge of the right wing, 3 new primary feathers were pushing through, their tips still wrapped in the translucent casing that gave them the appearance of small pale quills dipped in wax, while on the breast a scatter of downy feathers had loosened and stood slightly apart from the body, ready to fall at the slightest movement. The molt was always a difficult time for a falcon, a period of vulnerability and discomfort when the bird must replace every feather on its body in a precise sequence that had been determined by countless generations of wild ancestors, and during this time the falconer's role shifted from that of a hunter's partner to something more like a careful guardian. There would be no flying during the molt, no hunting, no hooding or training, only the slow and patient work of feeding and cleaning and waiting, day after day, while the bird's body remade itself feather by feather. Aldrich rose from his kneeling position and walked to the alcove set into the north wall, a small recess that had been carved out of the stone and fitted with a wooden door to create a cool storage space that stayed several degrees colder than the rest of the room even in summer. He opened this door and reached inside, his hand finding the familiar shape of a clay pot with a fitted lid, and he lifted it out carefully, holding it with both hands as he carried it to the table. The pot was heavy and cool to the touch, its surface unglazed and slightly rough, and when he removed the lid, the smell of fresh meat rose into the air, clean and slightly metallic. Inside, layered between strips of clean linen cloth, were the strips of meat he had cut the previous evening, long, thin pieces of rabbit flesh, pale pink in color and free of fat or sinew, each one about the width of his little finger and the length of his hand. He had chosen the rabbit specifically for this stage of the molt, knowing that its mild flavor and tender texture would be easy on the bird's digestion, and he'd been careful to remove every trace of membrane and every fragment of bone so that nothing would irritate the peregrine's crop as it processed its meal. The meat had stayed fresh in the cold alcove overnight, chilled by the stone that never quite warmed even in high summer, and now as he lifted the first strip from the pot, it was firm and cool between his fingers, still moist enough to glisten slightly in the candlelight. He laid 6 strips of meat on a clean wooden board that he kept for this purpose, arranging them in a neat row with small spaces between each piece so that he could pick them up easily without fumbling. The board itself was a simple rectangle of beechwood, sanded smooth and oiled with linseed until it had developed a soft golden patina, and it was scored across its surface with the fine parallel lines left by the knife during countless similar preparations. Beside the board he placed a small bowl of clean water, drawn fresh from the well in the courtyard the previous evening, and a square of clean linen cloth for wiping his hands. These preparations were as much a part of the ritual as the feeding itself, a sequence of small actions that had become so deeply ingrained that he performed them in exactly the same order every time, without variation, and the familiarity of this routine was itself a kind of comfort, a steady framework upon which the day would be built. When everything was arranged to his satisfaction, he picked up the candle and moved it closer to the perch so that the light fell more directly on the peregrine, revealing the details of its plumage and the precise condition of its new feathers. The bird watched him approach but made no move to retreat or to bait, remaining steady on its perch with the assured stillness of a falcon that had been manned for many seasons and had long since lost any fear of human proximity. Its jesses, the short leather straps attached to its legs, hung down from the perch block and swayed almost imperceptibly in the faint draught that moved through the chamber, and its bell, a tiny brass sphere no larger than a hazelnut, gave a single soft chime as the bird shifted its weight. Aldrich stopped at a distance of perhaps 2 feet from the perch, close enough to offer food, but not so close as to crowd the bird, and he stood there for a moment without moving, allowing the peregrine to become fully accustomed to his presence before the feeding began. The bird blinked once, slowly, its nictitating membrane sweeping across the dark eye from front to back in a motion that was almost too quick to see, and then it settled its feathers with a small shake that started at the head and travelled down the length of the body in a wave, ending at the tail with a slight spreading and refolding of the rectrices. Aldrich noted each of these small movements, cataloguing them in his mind as signs of the bird's condition and temperament. The blink was normal and relaxed. The feather shake was thorough and indicated that the skin was not itching excessively, and the tail spread revealed that 2 of the 12 tail feathers were still in sheath, growing steadily but not yet ready to break free of their casings. All of this information was received and processed without conscious analysis, the result of decades of observation that had taught his eyes to see and his mind to interpret the subtle language of falcon body signs in the same way that a scholar reads the letters on a page and understands the words without thinking about the shapes of the individual characters. He selected the first strip of meat from the board, holding it by one end so that the majority of its length extended from his fingers, and he raised his hand toward the peregrine with the slow, steady motion of one who knew that sudden movements were the enemy of trust. The bird watched his approaching hand with its dark eyes, and when the meat was perhaps 6 inches from its beak, it leaned forward slightly, opened its hooked beak, and took the strip with a delicate sideways motion, grasping it precisely at the middle and pulling it free from Aldrich's fingers with a single smooth motion. There was no snapping, no tearing, no sign of hunger or desperation in the action. The bird simply accepted the food as if it were the most natural thing in the world, tilting its head back to swallow the strip in 3 swift gulps that rippled down the length of its throat. Aldrich watched the throat feathers move with each swallow, noting the smoothness of the motion and the absence of any hesitation or difficulty, and when the strip had disappeared completely, he extended his hand with the second piece, holding it in exactly the same position as the first. The feeding continued in this manner through all 6 strips of meat, each one accepted and swallowed with the same calm deliberation, the bird eating with the mechanical regularity of a creature that did not experience hunger in the way that mammals did, but rather accepted sustenance as a simple requirement of its body, a task to be completed without urgency or excitement. Between each strip, there was a pause of perhaps 20 seconds, a space of stillness during which Aldrich remained with his hand at his side, and the bird remained motionless on its perch. And in these pauses, the only sound in the mews was the soft hiss of the candle flame, and the distant, almost inaudible whisper of the wind passing over the castle walls far above. When the 6th strip had been swallowed, and the peregrine had resumed its still posture with its feathers slightly fluffed in the manner of a contented bird, Aldrich wiped his fingers on the linen cloth and carried the empty board back to the table. He poured a small amount of water from the bowl into a shallow stone dish and set this dish on the edge of the perch block, positioning it so that the bird could drink if it wished, without having to leave its perch. The peregrine looked at the water for a moment, dipped its beak once in a cursory fashion, and then turned its attention to preening, reaching back with its beak to nibble gently at the base of a new feather that was emerging from its shoulder. Aldrich stood watching for another moment, satisfying himself that the bird was comfortable and that the feeding had gone as it should, and then he moved to the nearest window and unfastened the iron latch that held the shutters closed. The shutters swung open with a soft creak of their wooden hinges, and the first true light of the morning entered the mews, pale and grey and cool, carrying with it the smells of the courtyard below, straw and damp stone and the faint clean scent of frost melting on the cobbles. The truce held the land in its quiet grip, and the morning stretched ahead with nothing to disturb its peace, nothing to break the slow rhythm of the day except the steady, patient work of caring for a bird that would soon be beautiful again, arrayed in a new plumage that would carry it through another year of flight and hunting, of life lived in partnership with the man who stood now in the grey light, watching the dawn arrive over the walls of a world that had, for this brief time, agreed to be still. After the morning feeding was complete and the peregrine had settled back into its quiet preening, Aldrich stood for a while near the open window, letting the cool air move across his face and neck, while he considered the work that still lay ahead. The sun had now cleared the eastern wall of the castle, and the light that entered the mews was no longer the thin grey of dawn, but a thicker, warmer shade that brought out the brown tones in the straw and made the dust motes glitter like tiny flecks of mica as they drifted through the beam. He had fed the birds 6 strips of meat, which was the proper amount for the first meal of the day during the early stages of the molt, but there would be another feeding at midday and a smaller one in the evening, and for those he would need fresh strips cut from the supply he kept in the cold room below the kitchen. The strips he had used that morning had been the last of the batch he had prepared the previous evening, and now it was time to make more, to replenish the clay pot with a new supply so that the rhythm of the day would not be interrupted later by the need for hasty preparation. The preparation of meat, he had learned long ago, was not a task that could be hurried without consequence. A strip cut too thick might lodge in the bird's crop and cause slow digestion, while one cut too thin might be swallowed without giving the peregrine the satisfaction of gripping its food, and the texture of the meat had to be just so, free of any membrane or sinew that could tangle around the bird's tongue or catch in its throat. All of this required time and attention, and he had built his daily schedule around the certainty that the cutting of meat would occupy a significant portion of the morning. He turned from the window, crossed the mews floor with his quiet step, and paused at the table to snuff out the candle between thumb and forefinger. Not because the light was no longer needed, but because he did not like to burn wax unnecessarily when the sun was already filling the room. A thin thread of smoke rose from the extinguished wick and curled upward in a delicate spiral that dissipated before it reached the vaulted ceiling, and the smell of hot beeswax mingled briefly with the other scents of the room before fading into the background. He then walked to the alcove where he had stored the morning's meat, but instead of opening the small wooden door there, he passed it by and went to the outer door of the mews, the heavy oak door that led directly into the courtyard, and he unlatched it and stepped outside into the full light of the spring morning. The courtyard was a broad, open space paved with cobbles that had been worn smooth by centuries of foot traffic and cartwheels, and it was bordered on all sides by the tall stone walls of the castle's inner buildings, the great hall to the south, the kitchens and storehouses to the east, the chapel and the clerk's quarters to the west, and the gatehouse looming to the north, its heavy portcullis raised and its massive ironclad doors standing open to admit the carts that brought supplies from the surrounding farms. The truce had thinned the population of the castle somewhat, as many of the men-at-arms had been given leave to visit their homes, and so the courtyard was quieter than it might have been in a normal year, with fewer figures crossing its expanse and fewer voices calling out from doorways. Those who remained had fallen into a habit of speaking softly, as if the truce had placed a hush over the entire world, and even the blacksmith's hammer, which could usually be heard ringing out from the forge in the far corner, was muffled today by the closed door of his workshop, the smith perhaps busy with quieter work inside. Aldrich crossed the courtyard at his usual measured pace, his boots sounding on the cobbles with a steady rhythm that echoed slightly off the walls, and he nodded to a servant girl who was drawing water from the well, a young woman in a grey dress with a wooden bucket that creaked on its iron handle as she hauled it up hand over hand. She nodded back without speaking, and he passed on through the low archway that led to the kitchen quarters, a narrow passage roofed with heavy timber and smelling strongly of wood smoke and baking bread and the faint sharp tang of vinegar from the pickling jars stored along one wall. The cold room was at the far end of this passage, a small chamber built half into the ground, with walls of stone that were always damp to the touch and a ceiling so low that Aldrich had to stoop slightly as he entered. The room was dark, lit only by what light crept in from the passage, and the air inside was markedly colder than the air without, as if winter had found a permanent home in this one small space and refused to leave no matter what the season. Shelves of rough-hewn wood lined the walls, and on these shelves sat a variety of covered pots and wrapped bundles, each one labelled with a small mark scratched into the clay or drawn on the cloth in charcoal. Hare, fowl, beef, mutton, and the various mixtures that Aldrich prepared for the birds according to their needs. He reached up to the shelf marked with the sign of the rabbit, a simple loop with 2 long ears scratched into the pot lid, and he lifted down a bundle wrapped in a square of clean linen cloth, tied at the top with a length of twine. The bundle was roughly the size of a man's 2 fists held together, and it had the satisfying weight of fresh meat, not yet stiffened by too much cold, but cooled enough to be firm and easy to handle. He tucked it under his arm, closed the door of the cold room behind him, and retraced his steps through the passage and across the courtyard to the mews, the bundle cool against his side through the wool of his tunic. Back inside the mews, he set the bundle on the table and untied the twine with care, winding the short length of cord around his fingers and placing it aside to be used again, for twine was not a thing to be wasted. The cloth fell open, and there on the wood was the meat, a large section of rabbit, the saddle and hindquarters, the flesh a pale pinkish brown with a faint sheen of moisture on its surface, and the subtle grain of muscle running through it in fine lines. It had been skinned and cleaned by the kitchen boy the previous afternoon, and the work had been done well, with no nicks in the flesh and no fragments of fur clinging to the edges. Aldrich inspected it with a quick but thorough eye, turning it over once to examine both sides, and then he nodded to himself, satisfied that it was fresh and suitable. He went to the shelf where he kept his tools and took down the wooden board, the same board he had used that morning, which he now wiped clean with a damp cloth and set in the center of the table, where the light from the window fell directly upon it. Beside the board he placed a small earthenware dish of water for moistening his fingers if the meat became sticky, and the clay pot with its fitted lid for storing the finished strips. And then he reached for the knife. The knife was a small thing, but it was the most carefully tended tool he owned. Its blade was no longer than his middle finger, forged of good steel that had been hardened and tempered by the castle smith under Aldrich's exacting instructions, and it was set into a handle of oiled walnut that had been shaped to fit his grip with a gentle curve at the end that nestled against the heel of his palm. The edge was honed to such sharpness that it would part the fibers of the meat with almost no pressure, and he maintained this edge with daily attention, drawing it across a leather strop until it gleamed with a mirror polish along the bevel. Before each use, he tested the blade on a scrap of linen, slicing a corner of the cloth to see if the cut was clean and effortless, and this morning the blade passed through the fabric as if it were cutting through water, leaving a crisp edge with no loose threads. He set the knife on the board, blade facing away from him in the habit of all careful craftsmen, and then he poured a small amount of water from the earthenware dish over his hands, rubbing them together slowly to remove any trace of dust or oil that might have accumulated. He dried them on the square of clean linen that hung from a hook at the side of the table, and then he looked over at the peregrine. The bird was watching him. It had stopped its preening, and now sat perfectly still on its perch, its head cocked to the very slight angle, its dark eyes fixed on Aldrich with an unblinking intensity that had nothing of threat in it, but was simply the deep, patient attention of a creature that observed everything in its domain. The peregrine had seen this ritual many times before, and it seemed to understand that the actions at the table were connected to the food that would later appear in its beak, because it settled its feathers slightly and let out a single, soft sound. Not a cry or a chirp, but a low, breathy sound that was halfway between a sigh and a cluck, a sound of quiet expectation. Aldrich glanced at the bird and gave the smallest nod, an acknowledgement that required no words, and then he turned his full attention to the meat on the board. He began by examining the cut of rabbit in its entirety, turning it this way and that in the light to see the natural lines of the muscle and the places where the silver skin, the thin, translucent membrane that covered certain parts of the flesh, would need to be removed. Using the very tip of the knife, he lifted one edge of this membrane and, with a slow, steady pull of his other hand, peeled it away in a single sheet, the tissue separating from the muscle with a soft tearing sound that was almost too quiet to hear. He folded the membrane and set it aside on a scrap of linen. It would not be fed to the peregrine, but it could be boiled down for broth later, and nothing in the mews was ever truly wasted. With the muscle now clean and bare, he considered where to make the first cut. The grain of the meat ran in long, parallel lines from the front of the saddle toward the hind quarters, and the strips, if they were to be tender and easy to swallow, had to be cut across this grain, slicing through the fibers at a right angle, so that each strip would break apart cleanly in the bird's crop without forming a tough knot of connective tissue. He positioned the meat so that the grain ran at a diagonal to the edge of the board, and he placed the fingers of his left hand lightly on the surface of the flesh to steady it, his fingertips feeling the slight give of the muscle and the cool temperature of the meat. The first cut was always the most deliberate. He laid the blade at the far right edge of the saddle, angled it so that the edge met the meat at a shallow angle, and pushed forward with a gentle, continuous pressure. The knife slid through the flesh with no resistance, the steel parting the fibers cleanly and leaving behind a smooth, even surface that glistened in the sunlight. The strip that fell away onto the board was thin, perhaps 1/8 of an inch in thickness, and it held together in a neat rectangle of uniform color and texture, with no ragged edges and no tears. Aldrich picked it up between thumb and forefinger, held it to the light, and examined it closely. The thickness was even from end to end. The length was about the span of his hand from wrist to middle fingertip, and the width was enough to make a substantial mouthful for the bird, without being so wide that it would be awkward to swallow. Satisfied, he laid the strip at the top of the board, aligning it carefully so that it formed the first in what would become a neat row of identical pieces, and then he returned the knife to the meat for the second cut. The second cut followed the first with the same measured pace, the blade entering the flesh at the same shallow angle and travelling through it with the same smooth, uninterrupted motion, and the resulting strip was a near-perfect match to its predecessor, falling onto the board and lying there with a slight curl at one end that Aldrich smoothed out with a fingertip before placing it beside the first. He settled into the rhythm of the work, a rhythm that was slow and steady and unvarying, each cut taking perhaps 30 seconds from the moment the blade touched the meat to the moment the finished strip was laid in its place. His breathing slowed to match the pace of his hands, and his attention narrowed until there was nothing in the world but the grain of the muscle, the gleam of the blade, and the small, cool weight of each strip as he transferred it to the row. The peregrine watched all of this with its dark, still eyes, its body motionless on the perch, its gaze following the movement of Aldrich's hands without flickering or shifting, as if it were witnessing the unfolding of some ancient and important ritual that required the deepest concentration. As the row of strips grew longer, the light in the mews began to change by small increments, the sun climbing higher in the sky and touching different parts of the walls and the floor. At the start of the cutting, the beam from the window had fallen squarely on the table, illuminating the board and the meat with a clear, direct light that made every detail stand out sharply. Now, perhaps an hour later, the beam had shifted so that it fell across the stone floor in a bright rectangle that crept slowly toward the base of the peregrine's perch, its edge advancing with the almost imperceptible motion of the hour. The straw on the floor rustled once or twice as some small current of air moved through the room, and from the courtyard came the distant, muted sounds of the castle going about its day, the brief scrape of a wooden door opening and closing, the murmur of voices speaking in a language that was too far away to be deciphered, the bleat of a goat from the pens near the outer wall. None of these sounds disturbed the quiet concentration within the mews. They simply added another layer to the deep stillness that surrounded the table and the man and the bird, a backdrop of ordinary life that made the silence of the cutting seem even deeper by contrast. Aldrich paused once to wipe the blade clean with the damp cloth and to rinse his fingers in the bowl of water, for the meat had left a faint film on his skin that might cause the knife to slip if he allowed it to build up. He dried his hands again, took a sip of water from a leather flask he kept on the shelf, and then returned to the board, picking up the knife with the same careful grip as before. The meat had diminished now, the saddle entirely reduced to strips, and the knife working its way through the thicker muscle of the hindquarters, and the pile of strips on the board had grown to 18, arranged in 3 rows of 6, each piece straight and uniform, and gleaming faintly with its own moisture. The bird had still not moved from its perch, and Aldrich, glancing at it as he resumed cutting, noted that the peregrine's eyes were half closed now, not in sleep, but in that state of relaxed watchfulness that was the default condition of a contented falcon at rest. A single downy feather had drifted from its breast and was clinging to the edge of the perch block, moving slightly in the draught, and the bird's bell gave another soft chime as the peregrine resettled its feet, the sound tiny and clear and isolated in the quiet room. The cutting continued until the entire cut of meat had been transformed, the last strip taken from the very end of the hind leg, where the muscle tapered into a narrow point, and this strip, being slightly shorter than the others, Aldrich set aside in a separate place on the board to be used as an extra morsel during the midday feeding, when the bird might be a little hungrier than usual. He counted the finished strips by touching each one lightly with a fingertip as he moved along the rows, numbering them silently, 24 full-length strips and 1 shorter piece, enough for 2 more feedings with a small reserve left over for the following morning. He then opened the clay pot and began transferring the strips into it, laying them between fresh layers of linen cloth that he had cut to size and moistened slightly with water so that they would keep the meat from drying out. Each strip was placed carefully, none overlapping with another, the cloth folded over and smoothed down before the next layer was added, and when the pot was full he fitted the lid firmly in place and carried it back to the cold alcove, setting it on the stone shelf where it would stay cool until needed. The knife, after the last strip was put away, received its own attention. Aldrich wiped the blade thoroughly, first with the damp cloth and then with the dry linen, removing every trace of meat and moisture before drawing the edge in 3 slow passes across the leather strop that hung from the side of the table. The strop was a strip of thick leather backed with wood, darkened with use and impregnated with a fine abrasive powder that polished the steel to a gleaming finish, and the sound it made as the blade moved across it was a soft, rhythmic whisper that repeated 3 times and then was still. The knife was then returned to its sheath, a simple leather case that protected the edge and kept the blade safe from accidental contact, and the board was wiped down once more and set back on the shelf where it belonged. All of this tidying was part of the ritual, a closing of the activity that marked the transition from preparation to waiting, and when it was done, Aldrich stood with his hands on his hips, surveying the clean table and the orderly mews, and felt the quiet satisfaction of a task completed without haste or error. The peregrine, throughout all of this, had remained on its perch, its eyes following the final movements with the same calm attention it had given to the cutting, and when Aldrich finally turned away from the table and walked toward the window to open the shutters wider and let in the full light of midday, the bird gave a small shake of its head and resumed its preening, nibbling at the base of a new feather with its hooked beak, unconcerned and at ease. Outside the window, the castle courtyard lay quiet under the broad spring sky, a sky of pale blue flecked with high, thin clouds that moved so slowly they seemed not to move at all, and the air that came through the window now was warmer, carrying the scent of fresh bread from the kitchens and the faint, distant sound of someone singing a song, in a language that Aldrich did not know, a song that floated across the walls and then faded, leaving only the silence and the steady, patient sound of the peregrine preening in the gentle light. The morning wore on in its quiet way, the sun climbing the pale sky and the shadows in the mews shrinking back toward the walls, as the hours passed without hurry or interruption. Aldrich, having put away the knife and the board and the clay pot of fresh strips, found himself in that stretch of time that lay between the morning's work and the midday feeding, a space of perhaps 2 hours that required nothing urgent but offered many small tasks to fill it. He moved through these tasks with the same steady, unhurried care he gave to everything, his mind neither restless nor bored, but simply present, attending to the details of the mews in the way that a gardener attends to a familiar plot of land. He swept the stone floor in long, even strokes with a broom of birch twigs bound together with leather thongs, gathering the scattered straw and the fallen bits of feather and the fine dust that had settled overnight into a neat pile near the door, which he then scooped onto a wooden shovel and carried outside to the midden heap. He checked the perches one by one, running his fingers along the smooth wood to feel for any splinters or rough spots that might catch a feather or irritate a talon, and finding none, he wiped each block with a cloth dampened in water mixed with a small amount of vinegar to keep the wood clean and free of mites. He refilled the stone water dish from the pitcher he kept on the shelf, pouring slowly so as not to spill a drop, and he placed it back on the edge of the perch block where the bird could reach it without straining. He examined the jesses on the peregrine's legs, lifting each one gently between thumb and forefinger to check the leather for cracks or wear, and he replaced the small brass swivel that connected the jesses to the leash, choosing a slightly newer one from the supply in his toolbox, because the old one had begun to show a faint green patina of age. Through all of this, the peregrine remained on its perch, watching him with the calm, dark eyes of a creature that had long ago ceased to find human activity either interesting or threatening, its head turning only slightly to follow Aldrich's movements as he crossed back and forth across the room. By the time these small duties were finished, the light through the window had shifted yet again, the bright rectangle that had been creeping across the floor now climbing the far wall and touching the lower edge of the vaulted ceiling, and the quality of the air had changed from the thin coolness of morning to the fuller warmth of midday. Aldrich could feel the difference on his skin as he stood near the window, the sun now high enough that its rays carried a distinct heat even through the cool spring air. And he could smell the change too, the morning scent of damp stone and frost giving way to the drier smells of warm straw and sun-heated wood, and the faint, distant aroma of roasting meat from the kitchen chimneys. He knew that the peregrine would be growing hungry again, not with the sharp hunger of a bird that had been flown and worked hard, but with the gentler, more patient hunger of a molting falcon that burned its energy slowly, replacing feathers rather than chasing prey. The 6 strips he had given at dawn would have been mostly digested by now, passed through the crop and into the stomach in the slow, steady process of avian metabolism, and the bird would be ready for the larger meal of midday, the meal that would sustain it through the long afternoon and into the evening. He walked to the cold alcove and opened the small wooden door, and there on the stone shelf sat the clay pot he had filled earlier, its lid still firmly in place and its sides cool to the touch. He lifted it out, carried it to the table, and removed the lid, and the smell of the fresh rabbit strips rose up to meet him, still clean and sweet and unchanged from the morning. The linen cloths inside were just slightly damp, and the strips themselves were firm and cool, arranged in their neat layers with no discoloration or drying at the edges. From the pot he selected 7 strips, one more than the morning's portion because the midday meal was meant to be the largest of the day, providing the bulk of the nourishment that would fuel the slow work of feather growth. He laid them out on the clean wooden board in a single row, spacing them evenly so that he could pick them up one at a time without looking, and he set the board on the edge of the table nearest the perch. The peregrine, which had been dozing lightly with its feathers slightly fluffed and its head drawn down toward its shoulders, now straightened and became alert, its dark eyes fixing on the row of meat with the absolute focus that only a raptor could command. There was no sound from the bird, no cry or movement or sign of impatience, but its whole body had shifted from the relaxed posture of rest to the poised stillness of anticipation, its head lifting and its wings settling tighter against its sides and its talons adjusting their grip on the perch block with a tiny scrape of horn on wood. Aldrich noticed this shift and acknowledged it with the smallest nod, the same silent greeting he had given 100 times before. And then he picked up the first strip of meat and began the short walk to the perch. The distance from the table to the perch was no more than 8 or 9 strides, and Aldrich knew every inch of it, knew the places where the flagstones were slightly uneven, and the spots where a thick patch of straw might make his footing soft. He walked this short path now, with the deliberate care that the feeding ritual demanded, holding the strip of meat at waist height in his right hand, his left hand hanging loose at his side, his eyes on the bird. The peregrine tracked his approach without blinking, its head turning by tiny increments to keep him centered in its field of vision. And when he stopped at the proper distance near enough to offer food, far enough to respect the bird's space, the peregrine leaned forward on the perch, shifting its weight from its heels to its toes in the subtle motion of a bird preparing to accept a morsel. Aldrich raised his hand slowly, the strip of meat held between his thumb and the first two fingers, its end extending outward like a pale ribbon, and he brought it to the level of the bird's lower breast, the place where a falcon in the wild would take food from the talons of its mate in the aerial pass. The moment hung suspended in the still air of the mews, the man's hand steady, and the bird's gaze fixed, and the strip of meat glistening faintly in the midday light, and then the peregrine moved. The motion was precise and economical, nothing wasted and nothing hurried. The bird opened its hooked beak, not wide and not with any sign of aggression, but just enough to grasp the strip, and it took the meat with a delicate sideways movement of its head, the beak closing on the exact center of the strip and holding it firmly while Aldrich released his grip. There was a fraction of a second during which the strip bridged the space between the man's fingers and the bird's beak, connecting them in a single, continuous line of pale flesh, and then the peregrine pulled the meat free and tilted its head back, the strip hanging from its beak like a limp ribbon, before a series of quick, neat motions drew it inward. The bird swallowed in 3 distinct gulps, each one marked by a brief closing of the eyes and a rippling of the throat feathers as the meat passed downward. And when the strip had disappeared entirely, the peregrine opened its beak once, closed it with a soft click of the tomial tooth against the lower mandible, and looked at Aldrich again with the same unwavering attention, waiting for the next offering. Aldrich stood still for a moment, his empty hand lowering to his side, and he watched the bird's throat for any sign of difficulty, any hesitation or repeated swallowing that might indicate that the strip had been too large or too tough. There was none. The peregrine's crop, a soft, feather-covered pouch at the base of its neck, bulged very slightly now with the presence of the first strip, but the bird showed no discomfort, its posture remaining erect and its breathing steady. He waited the customary interval, a pause of perhaps 20 heartbeats during which the peregrine had time to settle the first strip fully into its crop and prepare for the next. And then he walked back to the table to retrieve the second strip. This pause between strips was not a matter of ritual alone, but of practical necessity, for a falcon fed too quickly might become agitated and bolt its food, swallowing strips before they were properly positioned in the crop, and this could lead to sour crop or impaction, conditions that were difficult to treat and dangerous to the bird. By waiting between each offering, Aldrich gave the peregrine's digestive system the time it needed to accept each strip in its proper order, and this patience was as much a part of the feeding as the meat itself. He returned to the perch with the second strip, holding it in the same position as before, and the peregrine repeated the same sequence of motions, the slight lean forward, the opening of the beak, the sideways grasp, the tilt of the head, and the 3 swift gulps that carried the meat away into the darkness of its interior. This time, after swallowing, the bird gave a small shake of its head, a quick, almost imperceptible motion that sent a faint tremor through its feathers and made the brass bell on its leg chime once. A single note that hung in the air for a moment before fading. Aldrich waited again, noting the head shake as a sign that the strip had been slightly wider than the first and had required a little more effort to position. But nothing in the bird's demeanor suggested that this was a problem, and after the usual pause he turned back to the table for the third strip. The third feeding followed the pattern of the first 2, the bird accepting the meat with the same calm precision, and by now the peregrine's crop was visibly fuller, a soft, rounded prominence that pushed the feathers outward and gave the bird a slightly lopsided appearance when viewed from the front. A full crop was a good sign during the molt, an indication that the bird was taking in enough nourishment to support the demanding work of feather production, and Aldrich observed it with quiet satisfaction as he went back to the table for the 4th strip. The molting process consumed a great deal of the bird's bodily resources, drawing protein and minerals and energy from the food and channeling them into the follicles where the new feathers were forming, and a falcon that was not fed adequately during this time would produce weak feathers with thin shafts and poor barbs, feathers that might break during flight or fail to provide proper insulation. The quality of the new plumage depended almost entirely on the quality and quantity of the food, and so every strip that passed into the peregrine's beak was a small investment in the future, a promise of strong wings and warm down, and the sleek, perfect contours that would allow the bird to stoop from the sky in the autumn hunts to come. With the fourth strip, the bird's pace slowed slightly. It took the meat from Aldrich's fingers with the same clean motion, but the swallowing took one gulp longer, a fourth ripple of the throat that suggested the crop was beginning to reach its comfortable capacity, and after the strip was down, the peregrine blinked slowly and resettled its wings, folding them more tightly against its body and giving a soft, almost inaudible sigh through its nares. Aldrich paused then, standing at the perch with his hand resting on his belt, and he studied the bird carefully, reading the small signs that indicated its level of satiety, the slightly fluffed feathers, the settled posture, the half-closed eyes. All of these suggested that the bird was approaching contentment, that the sharp edge of hunger had been blunted by the strips already consumed. He decided to offer the remaining 3 strips, but with a longer pause between each, giving the crop more time to accommodate the additional food, and he walked more slowly back to the table for the 5th strip, letting the second stretch out into a full minute before he returned to the perch. The 5th strip was taken with a visible deliberation, the peregrine grasping it and then holding it in its beak for a moment before beginning to swallow, as if it were considering whether it truly needed this additional morsel. But the swallow came, slower than before but still smooth and unforced, and the bird's crop now bulged noticeably, a soft mound of stored meat that shifted slightly as the peregrine adjusted its weight on the perch. Aldrich waited a full 2 minutes before retrieving the 6th strip, and during this pause he stood quietly at the perch with his hands folded, listening to the distant, muted sounds of the castle at midday. The clatter of wooden plates from the great hall, the chatter of servants in the passageway, the far-off bark of a dog somewhere beyond the outer wall. The peregrine listened too, its head turning slightly toward the window, but its attention was mostly inward now, focused on the sensation of fullness that was spreading through its body like a slow, warm tide. The 6th strip was the one that would determine whether the 7th would be offered at all. Aldrich held it out with the same steady hand, and the peregrine looked at it for a long moment, its dark eyes moving from the meat to Aldrich's face and back again. Then it leaned forward, took the strip with a gentleness that was almost tentative, and swallowed it in a series of small, careful motions that took nearly twice as long as the first strips had taken. When it was done, the bird's eyes closed for a full 3 seconds, and its head drooped slightly, the beak dipping toward the breast feathers in a posture of deep, digestive contentment. Aldrich knew that the 7th strip would be one too many, that the bird had reached the point where further food would only cause discomfort rather than nourishment, and so he made the decision without regret, carrying the final strip back to the table and returning it to the clay pot with its companions. The feeding was complete, 6 strips delivered and well received, and the peregrine now stood on its perch with a full crop and a settled posture, its body already beginning the slow, invisible work of turning the rabbit flesh into the stuff of feathers. He wiped his fingers on the linen cloth, poured a little fresh water into the stone dish, and set it within easy reach of the perch, and then he stepped back, giving the bird the space it would want now for digestion and rest. The peregrine, as if acknowledging this courtesy, shifted on its perch so that it faced slightly away from Aldrich, presenting its left side to him rather than its full front, a posture that in falconry meant trust and ease. From this angle, Aldrich could see the new feathers growing along the bird's wing, the ones with the waxy sheaths still intact, and he could see the loose downy feathers that had detached from the breast and were clinging to the perch block and drifting in the straw. The molt was proceeding exactly as it should, at the slow and steady pace that was natural for a healthy falcon. And there was nothing more to be done now but to let the bird rest, and to keep the mews quiet and calm through the long, warm hours of the afternoon. He went to the window and leaned his forearms on the sill, looking out at the courtyard, where a few figures moved in the sunlight, their shadows short and dark beneath them. The truce still held, and the world beyond the castle walls was silent in a way that was rare and precious. A silence that seemed to settle over the fields and the forests, and the distant, unseen villages like a blanket laid gently over the land. Aldrich thought of nothing in particular as he stood there, his mind as still and quiet as the mews behind him, and after a time he pushed himself upright, stretched his arms once, and turned back to the cool, dim room where the peregrine dozed on its perch, its crop full and its new feathers growing, its trust in the falconer as steady and unshaken as the stones of the castle itself. The feeding was done, and the peregrine had settled into the deep stillness of digestion, its crop full and its eyes half closed, and its body motionless on the perch except for the slow rise and fall of its breast with each breath. Aldrich, having put away the remaining strips of meat and cleaned the board and the knife in his hands, found himself with nothing that required his immediate attention, no task that demanded to be completed before the next hour or the hour after that. The mews was quiet now, quieter even than it had been in the early morning, because the small sounds of preparation and movement had ceased, leaving only the soft background noises of the castle and the fainter, more distant sounds of the world beyond the walls. It was in these empty hours, the stretches of time that lay between the necessary duties of the day, that Aldrich sometimes felt the character of the mews most clearly, the particular blend of light and air and stone and living creature that made this room unlike any other place in the castle, and yet connected to everything around it by a web of subtle, almost invisible threads. He walked to the center of the room, where the straw was thickest and the flagstones beneath were cool and even under his boots. And there he stopped and simply stood, letting his arms hang loose at his sides and his weight settle onto both feet in a posture of absolute rest. Standing still was a skill he had learned long ago, in the early years of his falconry, when he had spent countless hours holding a perch on his fist while a newly manned bird grew accustomed to his presence, and the ability to remain motionless for long periods had stayed with him, becoming as natural as breathing. Now, in the quiet of the mews, he let himself become still, not stiff or rigid, but relaxed and balanced, the way a heron stands in shallow water, and he allowed his senses to open to the room around him. The first thing he noticed, as he always did when he paused like this, was the light. The window that faced the courtyard was a tall, narrow opening set into the eastern wall, perhaps 10 feet above the floor, its arched top following the curve of the vaulted ceiling and its stone sill sloping downward at a slight angle to shed rainwater. The shutters were open fully now, pushed back against the wall and secured with iron hooks, and through this opening the sunlight of the early afternoon poured into the mews in a single broad shaft that cut diagonally across the room from the window to a spot on the floor about halfway between the table and the peregrine's perch. The shaft of light was not uniform in its brightness. It was brighter at its center, where the sun's rays passed through the window without obstruction, and it softened toward its edges, where the light scattered off the stone reveals and diffused into the darker air of the room. The shape of it was roughly rectangular near the window, but spread and blurred as it traveled downward, so that by the time it reached the floor, it had become a large glowing ellipse of golden illumination that made the straw within its borders shine like freshly polished brass, while the straw outside remained in shadow, its color muted to a dull brownish gray. Within this shaft of light, 1,000 particles of dust were suspended, drifting and swirling in slow, continuous motion, like a constellation of tiny stars moving to some unheard music. The dust was made up of everything that passed through the air of the mews. Fragments of straw broken down by the passage of feet, microscopic flakes of dried feather sheath shed by the peregrine as it preened, fine particles of stone worn from the walls by centuries of wind and weather, and the countless other infinitesimal bits of matter that filled the air of any room where living things moved and breathed. These particles, invisible in the shadows, became visible when they entered the beam of sunlight, catching the light and glowing with a soft, warm radiance that made them look almost solid, like flecks of gold leaf floating on an invisible current. Aldrich watched them as he stood still, his eyes following the slow, spiraling paths they traced through the air, and he observed that no two particles moved in exactly the same way. Some rose upward on currents of warm air rising from the sun-heated stone floor, while others drifted sideways toward the window as if drawn by some faint draught, and still others seemed to hang motionless for long seconds before suddenly dropping downward to settle on the sill, or the straw, or the dark feathers of the peregrine's folded wings. The peregrine itself sat at the very edge of the shaft of light, positioned so that its head and the front of its breast were touched by the sun, while its back and tail remained in the cooler shadow of the room's interior. The light revealed every detail of the bird's plumage with an almost unnatural clarity, picking out the fine barbs of the feathers and the subtle variations in color that were invisible in lower light, the deep slate gray of the back fading to a paler blue-gray at the edges of each feather, the warm buff of the breast with its delicate horizontal barring of darker brown, the coal black of the primary flight feathers with their sharp, clean edges, and the bright yellow of the cerro and the feet, which seemed almost to glow against to dawn as a body. On the new feathers that were still growing, the waxy sheaths caught the light differently than the mature plumage, reflecting it in small bright highlights that looked like tiny beads of glass fastened along the shafts. One of these new feathers, a primary on the right wing that had emerged perhaps halfway from its sheath, shone with a particular iridescence, its exposed tip a deep, glossy blue-black that shimmered faintly with hints of purple and green when the bird shifted its weight and the angle of the light changed. As Aldrich stood watching, a single dust mote, larger than most, drifted down through the shaft of light and settled on the curve of the peregrine's head, coming to rest just behind the dark eye among the small, smooth feathers of the crown. The bird did not react. Its eyes remained half-closed, its breathing steady, its awareness turned inward to the slow work of digestion. The mote sat there for a moment, a tiny pale speck against the dark feathers, and then a second mote joined it, landing on the bird's shoulder where the wing joined the body. A third settled on the folded wing itself, and a fourth on the tip of the beak. And soon the peregrine was dusted with a fine scattering of these pale particles, so light and so small that they added nothing to the bird's weight and caused no discomfort, only a faint, powdery speckling that was visible only because the sun had made it so. The dust was always present, Aldrich knew, always falling through the air of the mews and settling on every surface, and he would sweep it away again tomorrow and the day after that, and still it would return, as patient and as persistent as the sun itself. His own clothing had not escaped the dust's slow fall. Looking down at his sleeve, the one that faced the window, he saw that the dark brown wool was lightly coated with the same pale powder, a fine layer that muted the color of the fabric and gave it a slightly faded appearance, as if the sleeve had been left out in the sun for many seasons. He raised his hand and brushed at the dust with his fingers, and it rose up in a small cloud that caught the light and swirled away, dispersing into the larger cloud of particles that filled the beam, and within a few seconds new dust had begun to settle on the same spot, falling out of the air to replace what he had disturbed. The dust was patient, and it had all the time in the world. The stone sill of the window was thick with it, a layer of pale grey powder that had accumulated in the crevices and along the sloping surface where the sunlight fell most directly, and as Aldrich watched, a new flake of something, perhaps a fragment of dried moss from the roof, perhaps a speck of ash from a distant fire drifted down and joined the accumulation, adding its tiny mass to the history of particles that had collected there since the last time he had wiped the sill clean, which had been perhaps 3 days ago. He made a mental note to clean the sill again soon, not because the dust was harmful, but because he liked to keep the mews in good order, and then he let the thought drift away, just as the dust drifted, and he returned his attention to the stillness. From beyond the walls, a sound came floating into the mews through the open window, a sound so soft and so familiar that Aldrich heard it not as a distinct event, but as a continuation of the quiet, a deepening of the stillness rather than an interruption. It was the cooing of doves, coming from the castle Dovercote that stood in a corner of the inner bailey, perhaps 50 yards from the mews door. The Dovercote was a round stone tower with a conical roof and rows of small arched openings near the top where the birds came and went, and it housed a large flock of white doves that had been kept by the castle for generations, their ancestors having been brought from the south many centuries ago. The doves were a food source, their squabs harvested from the nests at regular intervals to supplement the castle's supply of fresh meat. But they were also a familiar sound in the daily life of the castle, their soft, rolling calls drifting across the courtyard at all hours of the day. The sound they made was a low, throaty coo that rose and fell in a gentle rhythm, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the bird's body and to carry with it a sense of warmth and contentment and endless patience. One dove would begin, its voice a single note repeated 3 or 4 times, and then another would answer from a different part of the Dover Cote, and then a third and a fourth until the whole structure seemed to hum with a soft, continuous chorus that blended with the sunlight and the warm air and the quiet of the afternoon. Aldrich listened to the doves, and as he listened, his breathing slowed to match the rhythm of their calls, the rise and fall of his chest aligning with the coo and pause and coo again that came through the window. He had heard this sound every day of his life at the castle, and it had become for him one of the defining notes of home, as familiar as the creak of the mews door or the chime of the peregrine's bell. The sound did not disturb the falcon. The peregrine had grown up hearing the doves and showed no interest in them while it was on the perch, its hunting instincts dormant during the molt, and its attention focused entirely inward. The doves and the peregrine existed in separate spheres within the castle's small world. One a creature of patient domesticity, the other a creature of wild speed that was temporarily at rest, and the sounds of the one did not trouble the sleep of the other. The shaft of light had moved while Aldrich stood listening, creeping across the floor with the slow, inexorable progress of the sun across the sky. When he had first stopped to stand still, the bright ellipse on the straw had been centered near the table, its leading edge perhaps 2 feet from the base of the perch. Now perhaps half an hour later, the light had advanced so that its forward edge touched the perch block itself, illuminating the base of the stone plinth and the scattered bits of feather and down that had collected there. The change was almost too slow to perceive, and yet it was constant and unstoppable, a reminder that time was passing even in this room where nothing seemed to happen. Aldrich turned his head to watch the light's progress, and he noted how the advancing edge of the sunbeam brought new details into view as it moved. A small piece of straw that had been invisible in the shadow, now glowing gold, a flake of dried feather sheath, now revealed as a delicate, translucent scroll, and a tiny spider web stretched between 2 straws that had been invisible, and now sparkled with the light like a strand of fine silk. The peregrine, noticing perhaps the change in the light or the slight movement of Aldrich's head, opened its eyes fully for a moment and looked around the room with a slow, deliberate turn of its head. The bird's gaze passed across the sunbeam, across the table and the shelves and the closed door, and then returned to Aldrich, meeting his eyes with that calm, unblinking regard that was so characteristic of the species. There was no message in the look, no request or acknowledgement, only the simple fact of mutual awareness, the recognition by 2 living creatures that they shared a space and a moment in time. Aldrich held the bird's gaze for a few seconds, then blinked slowly, and the peregrine blinked in return, its nictitating membrane sliding across the dark eye in a swift, translucent motion, and then it resettled its head against its breast and returned to its half-sleep, its trust in the stillness as complete as the stillness itself. Another sound now joined the cooing of the doves, this one human, the faint rhythmic thud of the blacksmith's hammer from the forge at the far end of the courtyard. The smith had opened his doors now apparently, and was working on something that required a steady, measured beat rather than the heavy, ringing blows that shaped larger pieces of iron. The sound was a soft tap, tap, muffled by distance and by the thick walls of the mews, and it came at regular intervals of about 2 seconds, a slow, steady percussion that was almost musical in its regularity. Aldrich had known the castle smith for many years, a broad-shouldered man named Godfrey, who had hands the size of dinner plates and a voice so deep it seemed to come from the stones themselves. And he knew that the smith often used the quiet hours of the afternoon for the finer work, repairing hinges and latches, forging small hooks and rings, sharpening the kitchen knives and the steward's quills. The sound of his hammer was another note in the quiet symphony of the afternoon, a human counterpoint to the dove's soft cooing and the distant, almost inaudible rustle of the wind in the thatch of the roof. The light crept further, inch by inch, and now the warm edge of the sunbeam reached the peregrine's tail, illuminating the long, barred feathers that extended behind the bird in a neat overlapping fan. The tail feathers or rectrices were old ones, not yet molted, and they showed the wear of a full year of flight and perching, and the countless small impacts of daily life. The tips were slightly frayed, the barbs separated in a few places where the feather had been bent against a branch or the edge of the perch block, and the colour was a softer, more muted version of the deep brown that it would show when the new feathers came in. Aldrich studied these tail feathers with a practised eye, noting the places where the wear was most advanced, and he felt a quiet anticipation for the day when these old feathers would drop and the new ones would emerge, sleek and perfect and full of the dark, glossy color that marked a falcon in its prime. That day was still several weeks away, perhaps even a month, for the molt proceeded at its own pace and could not be hurried, and in the meantime there was nothing to do but watch and wait and allow the bird's body to do its work. A draught moved through the mews, a slight shift in the air that was felt more than heard, and the shaft of sunlight wavered for a moment as something outside the window, perhaps a banner on the wall, perhaps the branch of the old yew tree that grew beside the chapel, passed briefly across the sun, and then moved on. The dust motes swirled in response, their slow spirals accelerating into brief chaotic dances before settling back into their steady drift, and the peregrine's feathers lifted slightly, stirred by the movement of the air, and then smoothed down again. The draught carried a new scent into the room, the faint, pleasant smell of fresh hay from the stables, and Aldrich breathed it in, noting how the smell mingled with the existing scents of the mews to create something new and momentary, a combination that would never be repeated in exactly the same way. The draught passed, the sun returned, and the stillness settled back into place like a stone dropped into water, the ripples fading and the surface becoming smooth again. Aldrich shifted his weight from one foot to the other, a small movement that was the first he had made in many minutes, and he crossed his arms over his chest in a posture of relaxed contemplation. He thought about the evening feeding that lay ahead, a smaller meal of perhaps 4 strips that would be given just before the shutters were closed for the night, and he thought about the water that would need to be changed and the candle that would need to be lit, and the final check of the jesses and the leash before he retired to his cot. But these thoughts were not urgent. They were simply items on a list that would be attended to in their proper time, and for now there was nothing that needed doing, nothing that required his attention, nothing that disturbed the perfect, suspended calm of the mews and the afternoon light. The doves had quieted now, their cooing fading one by one until only a single bird remained, its voice a soft, intermittent murmur that seemed to be talking to itself in some private language of contentment. The smith's hammer had stopped too, the last tap hanging in the air for a moment, and then dissolving into the silence, and the only remaining sounds were the whisper of the wind around the window frame and the slow, steady breathing of the peregrine on its perch. The shaft of light had moved on, its bright ellipse now centered squarely on the perch block, and the dust was still falling in its patient, endless way, settling on everything and nothing, adding layer upon invisible layer to the history of the room. Aldrich stood in the quiet, in the light, in the company of the bird, and he let the afternoon pass without counting its minutes, content to be still in a world that was, for this brief and precious season, still itself. The afternoon was deepening, and with it came a small but significant event in the life of the mews, an event so quiet and so ordinary that it might have passed unnoticed by anyone who did not know to look for it. On the floor beneath the peregrine's perch, lying on the surface of the straw, like a leaf fallen from a distant tree, was a feather. It had not been there when Aldrich had swept the floor earlier that morning, and it had not been there during the midday feeding when he had stood at the perch and watched the bird swallow strip after strip of meat. But now it lay in plain sight, a single curved shape of dark grey-brown against the pale gold of the straw, and its presence meant that the molt was advancing in its slow, methodical way. Aldrich saw it from across the room as he turned away from the window, and he walked over to it without hurry, his footsteps quiet on the flagstones, and he bent down and picked it up with the same care he would give to any small and delicate thing. The feather was a primary, one of the long flight feathers from the bird's left wing, and its identity was clear from its shape and its size, and the particular curve of its shaft. It was perhaps 6 inches long from the base of the bare quill to the tip of the vein, and it had the characteristic asymmetry of a primary feather, with the leading vein narrow and stiff, and the trailing vein wider and more flexible, the 2 halves of the feather divided by the central shaft like 2 ribbons of different widths, sewn to a single spine. The colour was the deep slate grey of a mature peregrine's upper wing, dark at the tip and fading to a paler grey near the base, and across this grey were faint, almost invisible bars of a slightly lighter shade, the ghostly markings that helped to break up the bird's outline against the sky when it was in flight. Aldrich held the feather up to the light that came through the window, turning it slowly between his thumb and forefinger, and he examined it with the close attention that this small object deserved, for every dropped feather told a story about the bird's health and the progress of the molt. The quill, the bare, hollow base of the feather that had been anchored in the bird's skin, was dry and clean, and slightly translucent, its walls thin but intact with no signs of blood or infection or malformation. A healthy quill should be like this, he knew. A clear tube of keratin that sealed itself off cleanly when the feather was ready to drop, leaving behind a small tidy follicle that would soon begin to grow a replacement. He touched the tip of the quill to the back of his hand, feeling its texture, and it was smooth and hard and cool, like a tiny tube of polished horn. There was no softness and no residue, no sign that the feather had been pulled out before its time, or that the bird had been troubled by its loss. It had simply come away when the new feather growing beneath it had pushed it out, as natural and inevitable as a leaf falling in autumn. And the follicle on the bird's wing would already be busy with the work of producing the next generation of plumage. The vein of the feather, the flat, blade-like portion that caught the air during flight, showed the signs of a full year of use. Along the trailing edge, several of the barbs had separated slightly, their tiny hooklets no longer locking together with the perfect precision of a new feather, and this gave the edge a slightly fringed appearance when Aldrich held it up to the light. Near the tip, the wear was more pronounced. The very end of the vein was worn away entirely, the barbs broken off cleanly at their ends so that the feather's point was blunted rather than sharp, and small notch had been worn into one side where the feather had rubbed against something hard, perhaps a branch or the edge of the perch block or the railing of the mews window. This was all normal, all expected, the ordinary wear and tear of a feather that had served its purpose through many months of flight and weather. And it was precisely because of this wear that the molt was necessary, the bird's body replacing its old, damaged equipment with new, perfect tools that would carry it through the year ahead. He turned the feather over and examined the other side, which told the same story in slightly different details. The wear was a little less on the leading vein, which was naturally stiffer and more resistant to damage, but the color had faded somewhat from exposure to the sun, the deep grey of the outer surface giving way to a paler, more silvery shade that had been protected from the light by the overlap of the feather in front of it. This fading was something that only became visible when the feather was separated from the wing, and it reminded Aldrich of the way the stones of the castle wall were darker on the inside, where the mortar protected them, and lighter on the outside, where centuries of sun and rain had washed them to a soft, pale grey. Everything that lived in the world was marked by its passage through time, and this feather, now still and silent in his hand, was a small record of the year that had passed, a calendar written in keratin and pigment and the subtle language of wear. He placed the feather carefully on the table, laying it flat on the clean wooden surface with its curve following the grain of the board, and he returned to the spot beneath the perch to see what else might have fallen. There, half buried in the straw, about a hand's width from where the primary had lain, was a tuft of down. The down was a small soft cloud of pale grey fluff, perhaps the size of a walnut when gathered together, and it consisted of a dozen or more individual down feathers, each one a tiny branching structure with no central shaft and no rigid veins, only a soft, airy mass of barbs that were designed to trap warmth against the bird's body. These down feathers were the underlayer of the peregrine's plumage, the insulation that kept the bird warm during cold nights on the perch and cold days in the field, and they molted more or less continuously throughout the process, loosening and falling at the slightest movement as the new down pushed through from beneath. Aldrich gathered the tuft with careful fingers, lifting each small feather from the straw and collecting them into a soft pile in his palm, and he brought them back to the table and set them beside the primary, a study in contrasts, the long, stiff, functional flight feather and the soft, formless insulating down, both essential to the bird's life, both shed and replaced in the eternal cycle of renewal. He had a leather pouch for this purpose, a small bag of soft dark leather with a drawstring closure, and he kept it on a hook near the table for the collection of molted feathers. Some falconers discarded the old feathers or burned them, or simply swept them out with the straw, but Aldrich had always kept them, not out of sentiment exactly, but out of a sense that they were part of the bird's history and that they had value as a record of the molt, and as objects of simple, quiet beauty. The pouch already contained feathers from previous molts, from this peregrine and from others he had cared for over the years, a small archive of plumage that spanned more than a decade, and each feather in that pouch could be traced back to a particular bird and a particular season and a particular set of circumstances, if one only knew how to read them. He opened the drawstring now and slid the primary feather inside, its curved shape fitting neatly among the others, and then he added the tuft of down, which settled softly on top of the older feathers and seemed to glow with its own pale light against the darker colors beneath. He drew the string tight and hung the pouch back on its hook, where it swayed gently for a moment, and then was still. With the feathers collected and stored, Aldrich turned his attention back to the peregrine, which had remained on its perch throughout this small activity, its eyes half closed and its body still heavy with the midday meal. The bird had not moved while he had picked up the fallen feathers, and it did not move now as he approached the perch and stood at the usual distance, his hands loose at his sides and his eyes moving slowly over the bird's body in a careful inspection. During the molt, it was important to check the bird's condition at least once a day, to look for any sign of difficulty or discomfort in the places where the old feathers had dropped and the new ones were emerging. And this inspection, like all things in the mews, had its own quiet rhythm that could not be hurried. The most visible sign of the molt was on the bird's right wing, where the 3 new primary feathers that Aldrich had noted in the morning were continuing their slow emergence from their sheaths. These new feathers, which would eventually be long and stiff and perfectly formed, were now in an intermediate stage of growth. The tips of the feathers had broken free of their waxy casings and were spreading into the air as dark, glossy points, while the lower portions of the shafts were still wrapped in the translucent keratin of the sheath, which gave them the appearance of pale, slightly shiny tubes that tapered to the newly freed tips. The contrast between the sheathed and unsheathed portions was striking in the afternoon light, the white, almost opalescent sheaths catching the sun and reflecting it in small, bright highlights, while the exposed tips absorbed the light and showed only the deep, pure black-brown of fresh feather keratin in its perfect state. Along the length of each sheath, tiny flakes of dried casing material were peeling away at the edges where the feather's natural movements had cracked them, and these flakes would eventually fall away as the feather continued to grow, and the sheath was worn off by the action of preening and the simple passage of time. The peregrine was aware of Aldrich's inspection, in the way that all falcons are aware of the human standing nearby. Its head turned slightly toward him, and its dark eye opened a little wider to take in his position and his posture, but it did not rouse from its digestive torpor, and it did not shift its feet on the perch. This was the trust that came from long familiarity, the understanding that the man who stood there was not a threat and never had been, and Aldrich was grateful for it in the quiet, unspoken way that he was grateful for all the small blessings of his work. He continued his inspection, moving his eyes slowly along the line of the bird's body from the head down to the tail, and he noted each of the places where the molt was most active. On the breast, a patch of new feathers was coming in among the old, their sheaths just beginning to break open at the tips to release the first hints of the warm buff color that would characterize the mature plumage. These breast feathers were much smaller than the primaries, soft and rounded and designed for insulation rather than flight, and their sheaths were thinner and more delicate, almost transparent in the direct light. The bird had been preening in this area, as evidenced by the slightly ruffled appearance of the feathers and the small fragments of sheath that clung to the barbs like tiny shards of dried glue, and Aldrich could see where the beak had nibbled carefully along the base of each new feather, helping to crack the sheath and release the growing feather within. This preening was an essential part of the molt, the bird's own contribution to the process, and a falcon that preened regularly and thoroughly was a falcon that was comfortable and healthy and untroubled by the irritations that sometimes accompanied feather growth. A little further down, on the flanks beneath the folded wing, another cluster of new feathers was visible, these ones even smaller and softer than the breast feathers, almost like the down that Aldrich had just collected from the floor, but with a more defined structure. The flanks were a sensitive area for any bird, and the peregrine had not yet begun to preen there in earnest, leaving the new feathers still largely encased in their sheaths, with only the very tips beginning to emerge. Aldrich noted this, and made a mental observation that the bird might need a little extra care in the coming days, perhaps a slightly warmer mews, or a little more fat in the meat, to support the energy demands of feather growth in this area. But there was no sign of redness or swelling or any of the other markers that would indicate a problem, and so he simply filed the observation away and continued his slow, careful survey. The preening itself, when it came, was a thing of quiet precision that Aldrich could watch for long minutes without any sense of impatience or boredom. After he had completed his inspection and stepped back from the perch, the peregrine seemed to decide that it was time to attend to its feathers, and it began the grooming sequence with a slow, almost ritualistic deliberation. It started by turning its head to the left and reaching back with its beak to the base of the wing, where the new primaries were emerging from their follicles. The beak, with its sharp hooked tip and its smooth, hard surfaces, worked carefully along the base of the nearest sheath, nibbling and scraping with tiny, precise movements that cracked the brittle casing and allowed the growing feather to expand into the air. The bird's eyes were half closed during this work, its expression one of deep concentration, and its whole body was balanced on the perch with the effortless stability that came from a lifetime of practice. The bell on its leg chimed once or twice as it shifted its weight, and then it was silent again as the preening continued. The beak moved from one sheath to the next, working its way along the line of new feathers with a methodical patience that matched Aldrich's own patience in cutting strips of meat or sweeping the floor. And as each sheath was cracked and peeled away, the dark tips of the new feathers emerged further into the light, their barbs slowly spreading and flattening as they were released from their confinement. The old weathered feathers around the new ones seemed dull and faded by comparison, their color muted by a year of sun and wind, and the contrast made the new plumage look almost impossibly perfect, as if it had been painted onto the bird's wing by some careful hand. Aldrich watched this preening from his position near the table, his arms crossed and his weight settled onto one hip, and he felt the same quiet satisfaction that he always felt when he saw the bird caring for itself in the way that its instincts demanded. The peregrine knew what it needed. The peregrine had always known, for 100,000 generations of peregrines had known before it, and all that Aldrich had to do was provide the conditions and the food and the calm, steady presence that allowed those ancient instincts to function. Time passed without measure as the bird preened and Aldrich watched, the sun moving another small increment across the mews floor, and the shadows shifting by another few degrees along the eastern wall. The doves in the dovercote had fallen silent, and the blacksmith's hammer had not resumed its tapping, and the only sounds in the room were the soft, rhythmic nibbling of the peregrine's beak, and the occasional chime of the bell, and the gentle hiss of the wind around the window frame. The molting feathers lay in their leather pouch on the hook, their work of flight and insulation now complete, their place in the bird's plumage already being filled by the bright new growth that was emerging day by day and hour by hour in the patient ancient rhythm of renewal that had governed the lives of falcons since the first falcon spread its wings in the first sky the world had ever known. The mews had its own particular quiet, a thick and layered stillness that seemed to absorb sound rather than reflect it, and Aldrich had grown so accustomed to this quiet over the years that he no longer noticed it as a separate thing. It was simply the air he breathed, the atmosphere in which his days unfolded, as natural and as necessary as the presence of the peregrine on its perch or the steady rhythm of the sun across the floor. But on this afternoon, as the light began its slow descent toward the western wall and the shadows in the corners of the room grew longer and softer, he found himself becoming aware of the quiet in a different way, not as an absence, but as a presence that was being gently pressed upon by sounds from outside. The mews was not sealed off from the world, however much it might feel like a refuge, and the noises of the castle and the bailey beyond had a way of finding their way through the stone walls and the thick oak door and the narrow window that faced the courtyard, arriving not as intrusions but as reminders that life continued elsewhere, that the stillness of this one room was held within the larger stillness of the truce that had settled over the land. The first of these sounds to reach him as he stood near the table wiping a small spot of moisture from the wooden board with the corner of his linen cloth was the hammer. It began not as a clear, distinct note, but as a low, rhythmic pulse that seemed to rise up through the stones themselves, felt as much as heard, a thud that repeated at intervals of about 2 seconds with the regularity of a heartbeat. Godfrey the smith was working again, or perhaps he had been working all along and Aldrich had simply not been paying attention. his mind occupied with the feeding and the feather inspection and the quiet routines of the mews. The sound that reached him now was the deeper, heavier ringing of the forge hammer, the one the smith used for shaping larger pieces of iron on the anvil, a sound that was different in character from the lighter tapping of the smaller hammer that he had heard earlier in the afternoon. Each blow sent a faint vibration through the ground that travelled through the foundation stones of the castle and up into the walls of the mews, so faint that it was barely perceptible, and yet if Aldrich placed his hand flat against the stone of the windowsill, he could feel it there, a tiny, regular tremor that matched the rhythm of the sound exactly, as if the whole castle were a single instrument and the smith's hammer was its slow, steady pulse. The sound came through the window in waves, arriving a fraction of a second after it was made, the distance between the forge and the mews stretching the moment of impact into a soft, rolling note that hit the ear with a slight delay and then faded away into the deeper silence before the next blow fell. It was a sound of pure, uncomplicated labor, the ringing of iron on iron that had echoed through castles and villages and towns for as long as men had worked metal, and it carried with it a sense of solid, unremarkable permanence, the kind of sound that had been heard so many times by so many generations that it had become part of the fabric of the place, like the wind in the thatch or the cooing of the doves in their tower. Aldrich listened to it without actively listening, his mind neither rejecting nor embracing it, simply allowing it to be there as he set the cloth aside and walked slowly to the window to look out at the courtyard below. Through the window, the view was framed by the thick stone reveals on either side and the arched top that followed the line of the vault, and what he saw was a narrow slice of the bailey, bathed in the golden light of mid-afternoon. He could see the roof of the forge in the far corner, its dark thatch and the thin plume of smoke that rose from the chimney and bent sideways in the light breeze before dispersing into the pale sky. And he could see the open door of the smithy with the orange glow of the forge fire flickering within like a heartbeat of light to match the heartbeat of sound. The smith himself was not visible from this angle, only the evidence of his work, the smoke, the glow, the rhythmic ringing that continued without pause. Aldrich leaned his shoulder against the stone reveal and let his gaze drift across the courtyard, taking in the familiar shapes and shadows, and as he did so, another sound reached him, this one sharper and more intermittent than the hammer, the sound of wooden wheels on cobbles. A cart was coming through the main gate, its iron-rimmed wheels grinding against the uneven stones with a noise that was somewhere between a rumble and a groan, a low wooden complaint that rose and fell as the cart passed over the particularly rough patches where the cobbles had been worn into hollows by centuries of traffic. The cart was drawn by a single ox, a large, slow-moving beast of a pale grey colour that Aldrich could just see through the gate arch as it entered the courtyard, its head low and its horns curving outward in a wide, placid arc. The driver walked beside the ox with a long switch in his hand, though he did not use it, and he was speaking to the animal in a low, steady voice that was too far away for Aldrich to make out the words, but close enough that the tone of it, calm, unhurried, familiar, carried across the stones like the murmur of a stream. The cart itself was loaded with bundles of straw, fresh from the fields outside the walls, their pale gold stalks catching the sun and glowing with a warmth that seemed to make the whole courtyard brighter as the cart passed through it, and the straw rustled with a soft, dry sound that was audible enough in this distance whenever the wheels hit a bump and the bundles shifted against each other. The cart did not stop near the mews. It continued on its slow way across the bailey toward the stable block, where the straw would be unloaded and stored for the horses and the livestock, and as it passed out of Aldrich's narrow field of view, the sound of its wheels faded by degrees, the grinding and rumbling softening into a distant, intermittent crunch that was soon swallowed by the larger stillness of the afternoon. But the ox-driver's voice lingered a moment longer, a faint thread of sound that seemed to hang in the air before the breeze carried it away, and then that too was gone, replaced by the unchanging rhythm of the smith's hammer and the soft, pervasive quiet that filled the spaces between. Aldrich remained at the window, his arms now crossed on the sill, and his chin resting lightly on his forearm, and he let his attention wander across the courtyard without any particular focus. The bailey was not busy, not in the way it would have been in a year without a truce, but there were still figures moving here and there, going about the small tasks that kept the castle functioning. a servant woman carrying a basket of laundry toward the wash-house, a boy with a wooden yoke across his shoulders from which hung 2 buckets of water, an old man sitting on a bench against the chapel wall with his face turned up to the sun. None of them hurried, and none of them made any loud noise, and the whole scene had the quality of a painting rather than a living moment, a composition of light and shadow and slow-moving figures that seemed to exist outside of time. The next sound to reach the mews was that of voices, a low murmur of conversation that drifted across the courtyard from the direction of the well. The well stood in the centre of the bailey, a circular structure of stone with a wooden roof supported by 4 rough-hewn posts and a windlass with a rope and bucket that creaked whenever someone drew water, and it was a natural gathering place for the castle's inhabitants, a spot where people paused in their work to exchange a few words or to rest for a moment in the shade of the roof. The voices that Aldrich could hear now were those of 2 or perhaps 3 people, their words indistinct but their tone calm and unhurried. The kind of conversation that had no urgency and no particular purpose beyond the simple pleasure of speaking and being heard. One voice was higher, perhaps a woman or a young boy, and it rose and fell in a gentle, melodic pattern that made a sort of music against the deeper murmur of the other voices, and every so often there would be a pause and then a low, soft laugh that rippled across the stones like water over a shallow brook. The sound of voices was different from the sound of the hammer or the cartwheels, in that it was not mechanical or repetitive, but organic and variable, and it drew Aldrich's attention in a way that the other sounds did not because he wanted to listen, but because the human ear is tuned by nature to attend to the frequencies of speech. He did not strain to make out the words. The distance was too great, and the walls of the mews were too thick for that, and the words themselves were not important. What reached him was only the shape of the conversation, the rise and fall of it, the pauses and the overlaps and the occasional soft burst of laughter that seemed to brighten the air for a moment before fading back into the general murmur. He thought of the people at the well, the servants and the castle workers whose lives ran parallel to his own, but rarely intersected except in passing nods and brief exchanges about the weather or the state of the stores, and he felt a quiet sense of kinship with them, a recognition that they were all part of the same small world within the walls, all bound by the same routines and the same silent, invisible truce that had settled over the land like a blanket. Inside the mews, the peregrine had not stirred. The bird remained exactly as it had been since the end of the midday preening, its body still and heavy on the perch, and its feathers slightly fluffed in the manner of a contented falcon at rest, and none of the sounds that had passed through the room, not the ringing of the hammer, or the grinding of the cartwheels, or the murmur of the voices at the well had caused it to rouse, or to shift its weight, or to open its eyes fully. The peregrine's world was one of sharp, precise attention when it was hunting or flying, but here in the mews during the molt, that attention was turned inward, focused on the slow work of digestion and feather growth, and the ordinary sounds of the castle were as irrelevant to it as the rustle of leaves in a distant forest. It sat on its perch with the absolute stillness of a creature that had no reason to move, its head drawn slightly down toward its shoulders, and its wings folded tight against its sides, and its talons gripping the perch block with a relaxed, steady pressure that would not loosen until the next feeding or the next small event in the slow passage of the day. And yet, even in this perfect stillness, there was a sign of life, a small, subtle motion that Aldrich noticed as he turned his head away from the window and looked back toward the perch. The peregrine's eye, the one that faced him, was open just a slit, the dark iris barely visible beneath the heavy lid, and as he watched, the nictitating membrane swept across the surface of the eye in a single, fluid motion. The membrane was a pale, translucent lid that moved from the front of the eye toward the back, not up and down like the outer eyelids, but horizontally, gliding across the cornea like a thin curtain of clouded glass, and its purpose was to moisten and clean the eye while allowing the bird to maintain its watchfulness without the interruption of a full blink. The motion was so smooth and so rapid that it was almost too quick to see, a flash of pale grey-white that crossed the dark surface of the eye and was gone, leaving behind the same half-closed, unblinking stare that had been there before. A moment later, the membrane swept across again, this time from the back to the front, and then the bird's outer eyelids closed very slightly, tightening the slit by perhaps a millimeter, and remained that way for several seconds before relaxing again. Aldrich watched this small sequence of movements with the same quiet attention that he gave to everything in the mews, and he noted the regularity of it, the way the membrane swept across the eye at intervals of perhaps 15 or 20 seconds, each sweep a little different in its speed and its completeness, but all following the same basic pattern. This was the rhythm of a bird at rest, a bird whose body was functioning in the slow, steady mode of maintenance and repair, and the blinking of the nictitating membrane was one of the many signs that confirmed what Aldrich already knew. The peregrine was comfortable, untroubled, entirely at ease. He had seen this same slow blinking in falcons that were dozing on the fist after a long hunt, their eyes clouding over with the pale membrane as they slipped into that state of half-sleep that was the nearest thing to true rest that a bird of prey ever allowed itself while perched, and it always gave him a quiet sense of satisfaction to see it, as if the bird's relaxation were a reflection of his own. The hammer had stopped at some point while Aldrich had been watching the peregrine's slow blinking and listening to the murmur of voices from the well. The rhythmic ringing from the forge had ceased, and the silence that followed was deeper than the silence that had come before it. A true quiet that seemed to press against the ears. The vibration in the stone, which Aldrich had become so accustomed to that he no longer noticed it consciously, was gone too, and the absence of it made the mews feel suddenly more isolated, more separate from the world beyond its walls. He straightened up from the window and stretched his arms once, feeling the slight stiffness in his shoulders from standing still for so long, and then he walked back across the room to the table and poured a small amount of water from the pitcher into a clay cup. The water was cool and tasted of the deep, mineral darkness of the well from which it had been drawn, and he drank it slowly, letting it wash away the faint dryness that had settled in his throat during the long, quiet afternoon. From the bailey, the voices at the well had begun to fade now as the speakers moved off to resume their duties or to find some other spot of shade in the warm afternoon, and the only remaining sound was the occasional creak of the windlass as a new bucket was lowered into the well and raised again, the rope groaning slightly under the weight of the water. That sound, too, was irregular and unpredictable, a creak and a pause and then another creak, and it seemed to Aldrich to be the perfect accompaniment to this hour of the day, a sound that asked for nothing and expected nothing and simply existed as part of the fabric of the castle. He set the cup down on the table and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and then he turned to look once more at the peregrine, which had not moved at all except for the slow, steady sweep of the nictitating membrane across its dark eye. The bird's stillness was not the stillness of a statue or a painted image, but the stillness of a living thing that had found its perfect balance, the point at which all needs were met and all tensions were resolved, and nothing remained but the simple fact of existence from one moment to the next. Its feathers were warm in the light that still slanted through the window, and its crop was still slightly full from the midday meal, and its new pin feathers were growing in their sheaths with the slow, patient determination of all growing things, and the sounds of the world outside the hammer, the cart, the voices had come and gone like waves on a distant shore, leaving no mark and no disturbance, only the memory of their passing in the mind of the man who stood watching in the quiet golden light of the lengthening afternoon. The sun had climbed to its highest point, or nearly so, and the shadows in the mews had retreated to their smallest dimensions, gathering in pools directly beneath the perches, and along the base of the north wall, where the light never quite reached even at noon. The shaft of brightness that had been moving across the floor all morning had now shortened and intensified, its edges sharper than they had been in the gentler hours of dawn, and the straw within its boundaries had taken on a pale, bleached appearance, as if the colour had been slowly drawn out of it by the steady pressure of the light. The air in the room had warmed by several degrees since the morning, not to the point of discomfort, but to a temperature that made the coolness of the stone walls feel welcome, a reminder that the mews, like all stone buildings, held the memory of winter in its fabric long after the season had passed. Aldrich stood for a while at the table, his fingers resting lightly on the warm surface of the wood, and he let the stillness of the hour settle over him like a second garment, a familiar weight that asked nothing of him except patience. He had done all the tasks that the morning required, and all the tasks that the early afternoon had suggested, and now he faced that stretch of time that came every day between the midday feeding and the first stirrings of evening. A period of 2 or 3 hours during which the mews required nothing from him but his presence. The peregrine was deep in its digestive rest, its crop still visibly full and its body so motionless that it could have been carved from a block of dark feathered wood, and the only sign of life from the perch was the slow, steady pulse of the bird's breathing, a subtle rise and fall of the breast feathers that was almost hypnotic to watch. Aldrich had long ago learned that these empty hours were not truly empty, but were filled with a different kind of activity. The quiet, invisible work of restoration that happened only when the body and the mind were allowed to settle into stillness. And he had come to value this time as much as any other part of the day. He walked to the corner of the mews where he kept the 3-legged stool, a simple piece of furniture that had probably been in the castle for as long as the mews itself, its wooden seat worn smooth by generations of falconers who had sat on it while waiting for birds to feed or preen or fall asleep. The stool was made of oak, dark with age and polished by use to a soft, low sheen that caught the light in a quiet way, and its 3 legs were slightly uneven. A flaw that had been corrected long ago by the addition of a small wedge of leather nailed to the bottom of the shortest leg. Aldrich picked it up with one hand, feeling the familiar weight and balance of it, and he carried it to a spot near the center of the room where the straw was thick and the light from the window fell in a broad, warm band that would reach him without being directly in his eyes. He set the stool down carefully, making sure the legs were settled firmly in the straw so that it would not rock or shift when he sat. And then he lowered himself onto the seat with the slow, deliberate motion of a man who is in no hurry to be anywhere else. The stool received his weight with a faint creak, a single, soft protest of old wood that was more of a greeting than a complaint, and then it was silent, holding him steady as he adjusted his position slightly and let his hands come to rest on his knees. Aldrich's knees were covered by the wool of his tunic, and the fabric was warm from his body and from the sun that had been falling on him as he stood near the window, and he could feel the solid, bony shape of his kneecaps beneath the cloth, a reminder of the simple, physical fact of his own body sitting on a stool in a quiet room. He let his shoulders drop slightly, releasing a tension that he had not been aware of holding, and he let his head settle into a comfortable position, with his chin neither raised nor lowered, but balanced on the axis of his spine. And then he closed his eyes for a moment, just a moment, to feel the darkness behind his lids and the slow, steady rhythm of his own pulse in his temples. When he opened his eyes again, the mews seemed subtly different, as if the act of closing his eyes had reset his perception and allowed him to see the room anew. The light was still the same golden wash from the window, and the shadows were still the same dark pools beneath the perches, but the quality of the stillness had deepened, becoming not just the absence of movement, but a positive presence that filled the space between the walls and the ceiling and the floor. It was the kind of stillness that happened only when a person stopped moving and allowed the world to settle around them. And Aldrich, sitting on his stool with his hands on his knees, let himself sink into it like a stone sinking into still water, slowly and without resistance. His breathing, which had been quiet and regular throughout the morning, now slowed even further, the intervals between each breath stretching out until they matched the slow tidal rhythm of the peregrine's breathing across the room. He did not force this slowing or consciously attempt to match the bird's rhythm. It happened naturally, the way the rhythm of waves on a shore will gradually synchronize with the rhythm of a listener's heartbeat, and after a time he could not have said whether he was breathing in time with the bird or the bird was breathing in time with him. The peregrine's breaths were visible as a gentle expansion and contraction of the feathered body, a motion so subtle that it might have been missed by anyone who was not sitting still and watching with quiet attention, and Aldrich watched it now with the same unforced focus that he might have given to the movement of clouds across a summer sky, his eyes half closed and his mind floating in a state of calm, relaxed awareness that was not quite meditation and not quite sleep, but something in between. The stool beneath him was solid and steady, its 3 legs finding their purchase in the straw and the flagstones beneath, and the straw itself, which he had swept and tidied that morning, lay in a thick, even layer that cushioned the stool and absorbed the small vibrations that might otherwise have travelled through the stone. A few pieces of straw near his feet had been bent or broken by the passage of his boots, and they lay at angles to the rest. their pale gold surfaces catching the light in a way that made them gleam like tiny threads of silk against the darker shadows beneath the stool. Aldrich looked at these straws without focusing on them, his gaze soft and diffuse, and he noticed the way the light played along their lengths, illuminating the fine ridges and the small translucent barbs that branched from the main stems. Straw was a humble thing, a byproduct of the harvest that served its purpose on the floor of the mews for a few weeks and was then swept out and replaced. But in this light, in this stillness, it seemed to Aldrich to hold a quiet beauty, a simplicity that was worth noticing. Time, which had been moving at its usual steady pace all morning, now seemed to stretch and slow, its passage marked not by the movement of a shadow or the striking of a bell, but by the small, almost imperceptible changes that occurred within the mews itself. The sun continued its climb, and the bright rectangle on the floor shifted by another fraction of an inch, its edge creeping toward the base of the stool with a patience that made the movement of the hour hand on a clock seem frantic by comparison. The dust motes in the shaft of light continued their slow, spiraling dance, rising and falling and drifting sideways on currents of air that were too faint to feel, and their patterns never repeated exactly, each moment bringing a new configuration that was instantly replaced by another and another. An endless silent choreography that had no audience except the man on the stool and the bird on the perch. And then, into this perfect stillness, came a sound. It was a small sound, so small that at first Aldrich was not sure he had heard it at all, and it came from somewhere near the window where the sunlight was brightest. It was the sound of a fly, a single fly, its wings beating with that high, thin buzz that is one of the most familiar sounds of summer and early autumn, a sound that speaks of warm afternoons and open windows and the slow, drowsy heat of the middle of the day. The buzz was not loud or insistent. It was a delicate, quavering note that rose and fell as the fly moved through the air, sometimes louder as it came closer to where Aldrich sat, sometimes softer as it moved away toward the far corners of the room. The fly itself was a small, dark shape against the brightness of the window, moving in quick, erratic lines that were impossible to predict, and its shadow, when it passed between the sun and the floor, was a tiny flickering dot that darted across the straw and disappeared before the eye could fix on it. Aldrich watched the fly with the same calm, detached attention that he had given to the dust motes in the straw, his eyes tracking its movements without any effort or intention. The fly traced a path along the edge of the sunbeam, its body catching the light and flashing like a tiny dark jewel, and then it veered toward the perch where the peregrine sat motionless. For a moment Aldrich wondered if the fly would land on the bird, whether the small tickle of its feet on the feathers would disturb the peregrine's rest, but the fly seemed to sense the presence of the large, worn creature, and it swerved away at the last moment, buzzing up toward the vaulted ceiling where the shadows were deepest. Up there, among the dark stones and the ancient mortar, the sound of its wings became hollow and echoing, amplified slightly by the curve of the vault, and then it faded as the fly moved across the ceiling to the other side of the room. For several minutes the fly continued its wandering, buzzing here and there around the mews, landing briefly on the edge of the table and then taking off again, hovering near the cold alcove and then darting away, and all the while the peregrine remained absolutely still, undisturbed by the tiny intruder, its eyes half closed, and its breathing slow and its body suspended in that deep, digestive calm that was the closest thing to sleep that a falcon ever knew. Aldrich, too, remained still, his hands still resting on his knees, and his breathing still slow, and his eyes still following the fly with a gentle, unfocused attention that required no thought and no response. The fly was simply there, a small, living thing going about its small, living business, and its presence in the mews was no more remarkable than the presence of the dust or the straw or the man on the stool, all of them part of the same quiet tapestry that was woven anew each moment, and then unwoven and woven again without end. Eventually, the fly settled. It chose a spot on the stone sill of the window, a patch of sun-warmed stone that was dusted with the fine, pale powder that Aldrich had noticed earlier in the day, and there it came to rest, folding its clear wings flat against its back and becoming completely motionless. Its body, no longer blurred by the motion of its wings, was a small dark oval against the pale grey of the stone, and its legs, 6 fine threads of black, gripped the rough surface of the sill with a sureness that belied their delicacy. The buzz was gone, replaced by the deeper silence that it had briefly interrupted, and the mews settled back into its stillness, as if the fly had never been there at all. Aldrich looked at the small dark shape on the windowsill and felt a quiet sense of kinship with it. Two living creatures resting side by side in the warmth of the afternoon, each occupied with its own quiet state of being, and neither demanding anything of the other. The fly did not move again for a long time, and Aldrich, sitting on his stool with his hands on his knees, let the minutes pass without counting them. His thoughts, which had been quiet and slow throughout the afternoon, now became even slower, drifting across his mind like clouds across a windless sky, each one soft and vague and without sharp edges. He thought about the truce, not in any specific way, but as a general sense of the quiet that lay over the land, the rare and precious stillness that had settled over the fields and the forests and the villages beyond the walls, a stillness that was echoed here in the mews in the silence between the peregrine's breaths, and the stillness of the fly on the window-sill, and the slow steady pulse of his own heartbeat in his ears. And then that thought drifted away, replaced by nothing at all, and he sat without thinking, without planning, without any awareness of time passing except for the small, slow changes in the light and the shadows. The stool creaked once, softly, as he shifted his weight by the smallest fraction, and the sound was so quiet that it barely disturbed the stillness. A tiny note that rose and fell and was gone almost before it could be heard. The peregrine's bell chimed once, not because the bird had moved, but because a draught had found its way through the window and stirred the air just enough to set the tiny brass sphere swaying on its leather strap, and the note that it produced was high and clear and pure. A single, perfect tone that hung in the air for a moment and then faded into the silence, like a drop of water dissolving into a still pond. Aldrich listened to the note as it faded, and then he listened to the silence that followed, and the silence was as deep and as complete as any he had ever known. The afternoon stretched on in this way, without event and without urgency, the sun climbing the last few degrees of its arc, and the shadows beginning their slow, almost imperceptible shift from west to east. And Aldrich remained on his stool, his body at rest and his mind at peace, a man suspended in the golden light of a day that would soon fade into evening, but for now, in this moment, was endless and quiet, and full of the simple, unremarkable beauty of being still. The stillness of the midday rest began to loosen its hold on the mews as the sun passed the meridian and started its slow descent toward the western wall, and Aldrich, sitting on his three-legged stool with his hands still resting on his knees, felt the change before he saw it. It was a subtle shift in the quality of the light, a slight softening of the hard, bright edges that had characterized the noon hour, and it was accompanied by a faint coolness that crept into the air near the floor where the shadows were beginning to stretch out again after their midday contraction. The fly that had been resting on the windowsill stirred, lifted itself into the air with a brief tentative buzz, and then flew out through the open window into the brighter world beyond, its small dark shape disappearing against the pale blue of the sky. Aldrich watched it go, and then he straightened his spine, feeling the vertebrae click softly into alignment, and he placed his hands on his thighs and pressed himself upward into a standing position with the same unhurried care that he had used to sit down. The stool creaked once as his weight left it, and then he bent down, picked it up by one leg, and carried it back to its place in the corner, where it would wait until the next stretch of empty time required its service. His legs felt slightly stiff from the long sitting, a pleasant stiffness that spoke of rest rather than exertion, and he stretched them out by taking a few slow steps across the mews toward the table, his boots making their familiar soft sound on the straw and the stone beneath. The peregrine, still on its perch, had opened its eyes a little wider now, and its head had lifted slightly from the tucked position it had held throughout the midday hours, its dark gaze following Aldrich's movement with that calm, measured attention that signaled the gradual return of wakefulness after a long period of rest. The bird's crop was less full now than it had been after the midday feeding, the bulge of stored meat visibly reduced as the slow work of digestion had processed the strips and passed them further down into the stomach and the intestines, and Aldrich noted this reduction with a practiced eye, calculating the time that remained before the evening feeding would be needed. He walked to the table and stood there for a moment, looking at the objects that were arranged on its surface, the wooden board, the clay pot with its fitted lid, the square of linen cloth, the small bowl of water, and the knife in its leather sheath. Everything was clean and in its proper place, as he had left it after the morning's preparation, but he knew that the afternoon would require a fresh batch of strips for the later feeding and for the first meal of the following morning, and so the time had come to repeat the ritual of preparation that was as much a part of his day as the feeding itself. He reached into the cold alcove and withdrew the bundle of meat that he had been saving for this purpose. A second cut of rabbit that was slightly smaller than the first, consisting mainly of the forequarters and the loin, and he carried it to the table and set it down on the clean wooden surface with the gentle care that all fresh meat deserved. The bundle was still cool from its time in the alcove, and when he untied the linen wrapping and folded back the cloth, the meat inside was firm and pale and fragrant with that clean, slightly metallic scent that marked it as fresh and wholesome. He inspected it as he always did, turning it over once to examine both sides and checking the color and the texture and the smell for any sign that the cold storage had not been sufficient, and he found nothing that gave him pause. The rabbit had been well kept, and it was ready to be transformed into strips that would nourish the peregrine through the evening and into the next day. He set the meat in the center of the board, positioned at the same slight diagonal to the grain that he had used that morning, and then he went to the shelf and took down the knife from its sheath, drawing the blade out with a soft whisper of leather and steel. The knife was still sharp from the morning's honing, its edge gleaming with that mirror polish that he had worked into it on the strop, and he tested it once more on the corner of the linen cloth just to be certain, watching the fabric part cleanly beneath the blade, with no resistance and no loose threads. Satisfied, he set the knife on the board beside the meat and then went through the small preliminary steps that always preceded the cutting. He poured fresh water into the earthenware dish, moistened his hands and dried them on the linen square, and positioned the clay pot with its lid ready at the far edge of the table. The peregrine, now fully alert, watched these preparations with its dark, steady eyes, its head turning by small increments to follow Aldrich's movements, and its beak opened once in a small silent motion that was not a cry, but a kind of acknowledgement, a recognition that the familiar sequence of actions was beginning again. Aldrich picked up the knife and held it in his right hand with the same easy grip he had used all morning, the walnut handle warm and smooth against his palm, and he laid the fingers of his left hand lightly on the surface of the meat to steady it. The first cut was made at the edge of the loin, where the muscle was tender and free of sinew, and the blade slid through the flesh with the same smooth, effortless motion that it had shown in the morning, leaving behind a clean, even surface that glistened faintly in the afternoon light. The strip that fell away was thin and uniform and perfectly formed, and Aldrich held it up to the light for a brief inspection before laying it at the top of the board to begin a new row. Then he made the second cut, and the third, and the fourth, settling into the slow, steady rhythm of the knife with the same patience and attention that he had brought to every task since waking that morning. The knife moved through the meat with a quiet, regular sound, a soft slicing that was almost musical in its consistency, and the strips accumulated on the board in neat rows, each one a near-perfect match to its companions in length and thickness and texture. The light that fell on the table was different now from the light of the morning. It was lower and warmer, tinged with the faintest hints of amber that spoke of the approaching evening, and it cast longer shadows from the objects on the table, the shadow of the knife handle stretching out across the wood like a dark finger pointing toward the perch. Aldrich worked steadily, his breathing slow and his focus complete, and the world outside the mews faded away until there was nothing but the blade and the meat and the growing rows of pale strips on the board. The peregrine, for its part, had become more animated as the cutting progressed. The bird could smell the fresh meat, the scent of it filling the mews and reaching the perch on the faint currents of air that moved through the room, and its instincts, dormant during the deep rest of midday, were now stirring back to life. It shifted its weight on the perch block, the talons scraping softly against the wood, and it leaned forward slightly, its head extended toward the table, in a posture of keen, quiet interest. The bell on its leg chimed twice as it moved, the small brass notes bright against the deeper quiet of the room, and its wings resettled against its sides with a soft rustle of feathers that was louder than the sound of the knife. Aldrich glanced at the bird and noted the change in its posture, the slight tension in its legs, and the forward tilt of its body that signaled the readiness to eat. but he also noted that the peregrine was not baiting or crying or showing any sign of impatience. It was simply alert, aware that food was being prepared and content to wait for its proper time. He continued cutting until the entire cut of rabbit had been reduced to strips. The last piece of meat, taken from the narrow end of the foreleg, where the muscle tapered into a tendon, that he carefully trimmed away and set aside. The board now held a fresh supply of strips, 20 or so in total, arranged in 4 rows of 5, their pale surfaces gleaming in the warm light that slanted through the window. Aldrich counted them by touch, running his fingertip along each row, and then he opened the clay pot and began transferring the strips into it, layering them between fresh pieces of damp linen cloth as he had done that morning. The pot was soon filled, the lid pressed firmly into place, and he carried it to the cold alcove and set it on the stone shelf where it would keep until the evening feeding. Its contents cool and fresh and ready for the bird. With the meat put away, he turned his attention to the knife and the board, cleaning them both with the same thorough, unhurried care that he always used. The blade was white with the damp cloth and then dried with the linen, and he drew it across the strop in 3 slow passes, the leather whispering against the steel with a sound that was as familiar as his own breathing. The board was scrubbed with water and a handful of clean straw to remove any residue of the meat, and then it was dried and returned to its place on the shelf, the wood still warm from the sun that had been falling on it through the window. The linen cloths were rinsed in the bowl of water and hung over the edge of the table to dry, and the bowl itself was emptied out through the window, the water falling in a brief glittering arc that splashed onto the cobbles of the courtyard below and then was gone. The peregrine watched all of this tidying with the same alert attention that it had given to the cutting, its head turning to follow Aldrich's movements as he moved back and forth between the table and the alcove and the window. And when the last of the cleaning was finished and the table was bare and orderly once more, the bird gave a small shake of its feathers, starting at the head and moving down the body in a wave that ended with a quick flick of the tail, a gesture that seemed to express both anticipation and a kind of approval. Aldrich, seeing this, allowed himself the faintest of smiles, a small, private expression that was gone almost before it appeared, and then he walked to the window to look out at the courtyard and gauge the time by the position of the shadows on the cobbles. The afternoon was well advanced now, the sun having moved far enough to the west that the eastern wall of the bailey was in shadow while the western wall still glowed with warm golden light, and the shadows of the buildings stretched across the courtyard in long dark rectangles that overlapped and intersected in complex patterns. The cart that had passed through earlier was now parked near the stable block, its ox unhitched and led away, and the bundles of straw that it had carried were being unloaded by 2 men who worked with the slow, steady pace of labourers who had no reason to hurry. Their voices carried across the bailey in low, indistinct murmurs, punctuated occasionally by the rustle of straw as another bundle was lifted and carried through the stable door. The well in the centre of the courtyard was deserted now, its windlass still and its bucket hanging motionless at the end of its rope, and the bench against the chapel wall where the old man had been sitting earlier was empty, its occupant having moved on to some other spot of warmth or shade. Aldrich stood at the window for a while, his forearms resting on the sill and his eyes moving slowly across the familiar scene, and he thought about the evening that was coming. The evening feeding would be smaller than the midday meal, just a few strips to settle the bird's crop before the long night, and there would be fresh water to pour and shutters to close and a candle to light for the final check of the mews before he retired to his cot. The peregrine would eat with the same calm precision that it had shown all day, swallowing each strip in its deliberate way and then settling onto its perch with its feathers fluffed and its head tucked, and the night would pass in the deep, unbroken quiet of the truce, a quiet that seemed to grow deeper with each passing day. He straightened up from the window, stretched his arms once to loosen the muscles of his shoulders, and turned back to the dim, peaceful room where the peregrine waited on its perch, its dark eyes still watching him with that same calm, steady gaze that had been there since the first moment of the morning, and would be there still when the last light faded and the first stars appeared in the sky above the silent castle. The light in the mews had begun to change by the time Aldrich finished putting away the last of the afternoon's preparations, and the change was of the kind that came so gradually it was almost impossible to mark the exact moments when it began. The bright, clear gold of the midday sun had softened into a deeper, richer amber, and the shadows that had been shrinking toward the walls all morning were now stretching out again, reaching across the floor in long, dark fingers that seemed to pull the room toward the coming night. The shaft of light from the window, which for hours had been a broad, bright rectangle on the straw, had now narrowed and lengthened, its edges blurring as the sun dropped lower in the sky and its rays entered the mews at a shallower angle, and the color of it had warmed to a shade that was almost honey, a thick, golden luminosity that made everything it touched look softer and older and more peaceful than it had in the harsher light of noon. Aldrich stood near the table for a moment, his hands resting on the clean wooden surface, and he watched the light as it moved across the room with the slow, inevitable progress that had governed the entire day. The beam had now climbed the far wall and was illuminating a section of the stonework just above the perch, revealing the fine details of the masonry that were usually hidden in shadow, the chisel marks left by the stonecutters who had shaped the block centuries ago, the faint traces of old mortar that had been smoothed by countless hands over countless years, and the delicate, almost invisible veins of darker mineral that ran through the pale grey stone like the tributaries of a river seen from a great height. The peregrine, still on its perch, was bathed in this amber light, its feathers glowing with a warmth that made the dark greys and browns of its plumage look richer and deeper than they had at any other time of day, and its shadow, cast onto the wall behind it, was a soft, dark silhouette that shifted slightly every time the bird adjusted its weight on the perch block. The time for the evening feeding was approaching, not with any urgency, but with the quiet certainty of a routine that had been repeated so many times it had become part of the natural order of things, and Aldrich moved through the familiar steps with the same calm deliberation that he had brought to every task since waking that morning. He went to the cold alcove and opened the small wooden door, and the air that came out was still cool against his face, a reminder that the stone of the castle held the memory of winter long after the season had passed. The clay pot sat on its shelf where he had left it, its lid still firmly in place, and when he lifted it out and carried it to the table, the weight of it in his hands was comforting in its familiarity, a solid, known quantity in a world that was otherwise full of uncertainties. He set the pot down and removed the lid, and the smell of the fresh rabbit strips rose up to meet him, clean and mild and unchanged from the afternoon. The meat still firm and cool and perfectly preserved by the chill of the alcove. From the pot he selected 4 strips, fewer than the midday meal, but enough to settle the bird's crop for the long night ahead, and he laid them out on the wooden board in a single row with the same even spacing he always used. The strips were still moist and glistening in the amber light, their pale surfaces catching the last of the sun and glowing with a soft pearlescent sheen that made them look almost like something other than meat, like strips of pale silk or thin slices of some rare luminous stone. The peregrine, which had been watching Aldrich's movements with increasing alertness, now leaned forward on its perch, its dark eyes fixed on the row of strips with the absolute, unwavering focus that always preceded a feeding, and its beak opened once in that small silent motion that was not a sound but a sign, a communication that needed no words. Aldrich picked up the first strip and made the short walk to the perch, his boots quiet on the straw and the flagstones, and he stopped at the usual distance with his hand raised and the meat extended at the level of the bird's lower breast. The amber light fell across them both, the man and the falcon, connecting them in a single wash of golden illumination that seemed to hold them suspended in a moment outside of time, and then the peregrine leaned forward and took the strip with that same delicate sideways motion of its beak, the meat transferring from Aldrich's fingers to the bird's grip with a smoothness that was the result of years of practice and trust. The swallow came in 3 neat gulps, the throat feathers rippling as the strip descended, and then the bird was still again, waiting with the patience that was its nature for the next offering. The second strip followed the first after the customary pause, and then the third, each one accepted and swallowed with the same calm, mechanical precision that had characterized every feeding throughout the day. By the time the 4th strip was offered, the peregrine's crop was beginning to fill again, a soft rounded bulge that pushed the breast feathers outward just slightly, and the bird took this final strip with a visible deliberation, holding it in its beak for a moment before tilting its head back and swallowing in a series of small, careful movements that were slower than the ones that had come before. When the last strip was down, the peregrine blinked slowly, its nictitating membrane sweeping across the dark eye in that pale, translucent flash that Aldrich had seen so many times, and then it resettled its feathers with a soft shake and closed its beak with a quiet, final click. The feeding was complete, the last meal of the day delivered and received, and Aldrich stood for a moment at the perch with his empty hand at his side, watching the bird settle into the contented stillness that always followed a meal. The peregrine's posture had changed from the alert, forward-leaning stance of anticipation to the more relaxed, upright posture of satiety, its wings folded tight against its sides and its head drawn slightly down toward its shoulders, and its eyes, which had been fixed on Aldrich with such intensity during the feeding, were now half closed in that expression of quiet inward contentment that was the closest thing to a smile that a falcon could show. Aldrich nodded once, the same small acknowledgement that he had given at every feeding, and then he turned away from the perch and walked back to the table to put away the remaining strips and clean the board for the last time that day. With the meat returned to the clay pot and the pot returned to the cold alcove, he took down a fresh candle from the shelf, a new stub of beeswax that was pale yellow and slightly tacky to the touch, and he set it in the iron holder on the table and lit it with the flint and striker, the spark catching on the wick and blooming into a small, steady flame that pushed back the gathering shadows. The candlelight was warmer and softer than the fading sunlight, and it cast a small, intimate circle of illumination around the table, leaving the far corners of the mews in a deeper darkness that was not threatening but simply quiet, a darkness that had been part of the room for as long as the stones had stood. Aldrich adjusted the position of the candle so that its light fell across the perch without shining directly into the peregrine's eyes, and then he went to the shelf where he kept the water pitcher and poured fresh, cool water into the stone dish on the edge of the perch block, the water making a soft, musical sound as it filled the shallow basin and settled into stillness. And then, in the quiet that followed the pouring of the water, something small and silent happened on the perch. One of the new feathers that had been growing on the peregrine's wing, a primary that had been working its way free of its sheath throughout the day, finally loosened itself fully from the surrounding tissue and drifted down through the still air to land on the straw below. The feather was not an old one like the primary Aldrich had collected earlier, but a new one, still slightly curled from its time inside the sheath and not yet fully expanded into its final shape, and it lay on the straw like a dark, delicate question mark, its color a deep, glossy blue-black that seemed to absorb the candlelight rather than reflect it. The peregrine, feeling perhaps the small release of pressure where the feather had detached, gave a tiny shake of its wing and then resettled, and Aldrich, hearing the almost inaudible sound of the shake, turned from the water dish and saw the feather on the straw. He bent down and picked it up with the same careful fingers that had handled every feather throughout the day, and he held it close to the candle to examine it in the warm, flickering light. The new feather was perfect, or nearly so, its barbs still slightly compressed from the sheath, but already beginning to spread and flatten into their proper alignment, and its shaft was strong and straight and clean, the quill still soft at the base where it had been attached to the living tissue of the wing, but hardening rapidly as it dried in the air. This was a feather that had just begun its life, a feather that would carry the peregrine through a full year of flight and hunting and weather, and to hold it in his hand was to touch something that was both ordinary and miraculous, a small perfect object that had been made by the bird's body from the meat that he had fed it and the water that he had poured, and the quiet, patient care that he had given it, day after day, and the water that he had poured, and the quiet, patient care that he had given it day after day. He turned the feather over in his fingers, noting the subtle iridescence that shimmered along its length in the candlelight, and then he carried it to the leather pouch and slid it inside with the others, a new addition to the small archive of plumage that he had been collecting for so many years. The candle flame burned steadily on the table, its light reflecting in the peregrine's dark eyes as the bird watched Aldrich move around the mews, and the shadows on the walls danced and shifted with every small movement of the flame. Outside the window, the last of the daylight was fading from the sky, the amber glow giving way to a soft, deep violet that spread across the heavens like a stain of ink in water, and the first stars, faint and tentative, were beginning to appear in the darkest part of the eastern sky. A single bat fluttered past the window, its wings a dark blur against the fading light, and then it was gone, and the only movement in the courtyard below was the slow, steady pacing of the watchman on the walls, his lantern a tiny point of warm light that bobbed along the battlements like a firefly in the dusk. Aldrich went to the window and stood there for a moment with his hand on the shutter, looking out at the quiet castle and the quiet sky and the quiet land beyond the walls, and he felt the deep, settling peace of the evening descending over everything like a benediction. The peregrine behind him on its perch had begun to tuck its head under its wing in the first stages of sleep. Its body a compact shape of folded feathers and steady breathing, an absolute unshakable trust, and the small sounds of it settling, the rustle of feathers, the soft chime of the bell, the tiny click of a talon adjusting its grip on the wood, were the only sounds left in the mews. The day was ending, the molt was progressing, and the truce still held the world in its gentle, silent grip. And Aldrich, standing in the candlelight with the cool evening air in his face, could not have asked for anything more than what he already had: a bird on the perch, a candle on the table, and the quiet ancient stones of the castle wrapped around them, both like a promise of peace. When the last of the evening feeding was done, and the peregrine had settled onto its perch with the slow, heavy contentment of a bird whose crop was full and whose body was warm, Aldrich moved through the final tasks of the day with the same quiet, methodical care that he had brought to every moment since the first grey light of morning. The mews was now lit only by the single candle on the table, its flame a small, steady point of gold in the gathering darkness, and the shadows that it cast were long and soft and full of gentle movement, shifting against the stone walls with every tiny draught that passed through the room. The window, which had been open all day to the sun and the air and the distant sounds of the castle, now showed only a deep violet darkness beyond its iron bars, a darkness that was scattered with the faint cold light of the first stars as they emerged, one by one, in the vast, silent arc of the sky. He walked to the water dish first, bending down to check that it was still full and clean, the surface of the water catching the candlelight and reflecting it back as a small trembling point of gold that wobbled slightly as his breath disturbed the air above it. The peregrine would not drink often during the night, but the water was there if it was needed, and Aldrich liked to know that everything was in its proper place before the shutters were closed and the mews was sealed against the darkness. He straightened up and moved to the perch, stopping at the usual distance to look at the bird one final time before the long night began. And what he saw was the very picture of a falcon at peace. The peregrine had drawn its head down toward its shoulders and tucked it slightly to one side, the dark eyes now fully closed and the beak nestling into the soft, warm feathers of the breast, and its body was a compact shape of folded wings and settled plumage that seemed to radiate a quiet, absolute contentment. The bell on its leg was silent now, the tiny brass sphere resting against the wood of the perch block, with no movement to stir it, and the jesses hung straight down in the still air, their leather straps dark and soft and motionless. A single feather, loosened by the molt during the final preening of the evening, lay on the straw directly beneath the perch, and Aldrich bent down and picked it up with the same careful fingers that had gathered every fallen feather throughout the day. It was a small, soft feather from the bird's flank, pale grey at the base and fading to a warm, creamy white at the tip, and its barbs were still slightly curled from the sheath that had enclosed it, not yet fully expanded into their final shape. He held it for a moment in the candlelight, turning it to see the way the flame made the pale edges glow with a faint golden translucence, and then he carried it to the leather pouch and slipped it inside with the others, the last addition to the day's small harvest of plumage. The pouch was full now, the feathers of the molt accumulating day by day as the old plumage fell away and the new plumage grew in, and it swung gently on its hook as Aldrich closed the drawstring and stepped back, a soft, leathery pendulum that moved in the draught from the window and then was still. The time had come to close the shutters, to seal the mews against the cool night air and the darkness and the distant, unseen world beyond the castle walls, and Aldrich walked to the window with the candle in his hand, the flame cupped behind his palm to shield it from the breeze that stirred the air near the opening. He set the candle on the sill for a moment and reached up to grasp the iron ring that was set into the wooden shutter, and he pulled the shutter closed with the slow, steady pressure that made the old hinges creak softly, a sound that was as familiar as the chime of the bell, or the whisper of the knife on the strop. The shutter met the stone frame with a solid, satisfying thud, and the darkness in the mews deepened by a shade, the candle now the only source of light in the room. He fastened the iron latch, checking it with a small tug to make sure it was secure, and then he did the same with the second shutter, closing it and latching it and tugging it once to confirm that it would hold against the wind if the wind should rise in the night. With the shutters closed, the mews became a smaller, more intimate space, its walls drawing in around the candlelight, like a cloak pulled close, and the sounds of the outside world, the watchman's footsteps on the battlements, the distant bark of a fox in the fields, the soft sigh of the breeze around the tower, were reduced to faint, muffled whispers that barely penetrated the thick stone. Aldrich picked up the candle and carried it with him as he made a slow circuit of the mews, a final inspection that he performed every night before retiring to his cot. He checked the perches one by one, running his hand along the smooth wood of each block to feel for any splinters or rough spots that might have appeared during the day, and he found none. The wood still clean and even under his palm. He checked the straw on the floor, kicking it gently with the toe of his boot to make sure it was dry and thick and evenly spread, and he gathered a handful of loose straw that had accumulated near the door and tossed it into the corner where it could be swept up in the morning. He checked the door that led to the passage and the door that led to the courtyard, testing each latch with a firm press of his thumb to confirm that they were closed and secure, and he listened at each door for a moment, hearing nothing but the deep, solid silence of the stone and the wood and the night beyond. He checked the shelf where the meat was stored, though he knew the coal alcove was secure, and he checked the table where the board and the knife and the clay pot sat in their proper places, everything clean and dry and ready for the morning that would come, as it always did, with the first grey light through the eastern window. The Peregrine had not stirred during this circuit of inspection, its head still tucked and its breathing still slow and its body still wrapped in the deep, motionless rest that was the closest thing to sleep that a falcon ever knew. And Aldrich, standing at the centre of the mews with the candle in his hand, looked at the bird for a long, quiet moment before he finally turned toward the door of his small chamber. There was something about the sight of a falcon at rest, he thought, that brought a particular kind of peace to the heart of the man who cared for it, a peace that was made up of trust and familiarity, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that all was well in the small world that the two of them shared. He did not try to put this feeling into words, for he was not a man who thought in words about such things, but he felt it in his chest as a kind of warmth that had nothing to do with the candle or the straw or the thick wool of his tunic, and he carried it with him as he crossed the mews and opened the door to the passage and stepped through into the narrow dark corridor that led to his cot. The passage was cold after the relative warmth of the mews, the stone walls holding the chill of the spring night and releasing it slowly into the air, and Aldrich walked its length in the same 7 measured strides that he had walked that morning, his boots sounding softly on the flagstones and the candle flame flickering with each step he took. At the end of the passage, he opened the low wooden door of his room and ducked his head slightly to pass through the frame, and then he was inside the small, familiar space where he had woken what felt like a very long time ago, though it had only been a single day, a day that had passed in the slow, patient rhythm of the falconer's life, and now was drawing to its quiet close. His room was just as he had left it, the cot against the wall with its woolen blanket folded back, the tunic he had worn the previous day still hanging from its peg, the window slit, showing a thin rectangle of star-scattered sky that was the same deep, indigo darkness he had seen through the mews window. He set the candle on the small ledge beside his cot, the only flat surface in the room other than the floor, and then he sat down on the edge of the cot and began to unlace his boots. The leather laces were stiff from a day of use, and they made a soft, rasping sound as he worked them through the eyelets, a sound that was the last of the day's many small, familiar noises. He pulled the boots off one at a time and set them side by side on the floor at the foot of the cot, their toes pointing toward the door in the habit of a man who liked to know where his boots were in the dark. And then he lay back on the woolen blanket with his hands folded on his chest and his eyes looking up at the dark, vaulted ceiling above him. The ceiling in this room was the same as the ceiling in the mews, a vault of narrow stone set in the old manner and darkened by centuries of candle smoke, to a deep charcoal grey that seemed to absorb the faint light of the flame and give nothing back. And Aldrich had looked at this ceiling every night for so many years that he knew every line of mortar and every chip in the stone, as well as he knew the lines on his own palms. He traced these familiar patterns with his eyes as he lay there, his breathing slow and his body heavy with the pleasant tiredness that came from a day of quiet work, and he let his thoughts drift back over the hours that had passed since he had opened his eyes in the same cot that morning. He thought of the grey light of dawn and the first feeding, and he thought of the cutting of the meat and the rows of pale strips on the board, and he thought of the shaft of sunlight moving across the floor and the dust motes drifting in the beam, and he thought of the doves cooing in the Dovercote and the smith's hammer ringing across the bailey, and he thought of the peregrine on its perch, always the peregrine on its perch, its dark eyes watching and its new feathers growing at its trust in him, as steady and unwavering as the castle themselves. All of these thoughts were quiet and soft and without any sharp edges, and they drifted through his mind like the dust motes had drifted through the sunbeam, one after another, each one replacing the one before it in a slow, continuous flow that had no beginning and no end. He did not try to hold on to any of them or to push any of them away, and after a time the thoughts began to blur and fade, merging into a general sense of warmth and peace and contentment that was itself the product of the day he had just lived, a day that had been, in every respect, exactly what a day should be. Outside the window slit, the stars had grown brighter and more numerous as the night deepened, and they shone with the cold, clear light that was unique to the spring sky, a light that had travelled across impossible distances to reach this small, dark room in this small, quiet castle on the edge of the fields. The watchman on the walls had finished his circuit and was standing still now, his lantern a steady point of light on the battlements, and the only movement in the world was the slow, imperceptible turn of the stars as they wheeled through their ancient courses above the sleeping land. The truce held everything in its silent grip, and the night stretched ahead with no event and no disturbance, only the deep, unbroken stillness that had been the gift of this season and this place and this day. Aldrich closed his eyes, and the darkness behind his lids was the same darkness that filled the room, and the mews and the courtyard and the fields, a darkness that was not empty but full of the memory of the day and the promise of the morning and the quiet, steady presence of the peregrine on its perch, just a few strides away through the stone walls. His breathing slowed, his hands relaxed on his chest, and the last conscious thought that passed through his mind before sleep took him was the image of the new feather in the candlelight, its dark, glossy surface shimmering with the faint iridescence of fresh keratin freshly made, and then the thought dissolved into the silence, and he was asleep, carried into the deep, dreamless rest of a man who had done his work well, and would wait to do it again when the first grey light crept through the window, and the bell of the peregrine chimed once, softly, to greet the new year.